Welcome back to the DemystifySci podcast. I'm Michael Shiloh.
I'm Anastasia.
Today on the show, we have Arnie Benn from the Quantum Bicycle Society. Arnie has a number of different scientific ideas bubbling right now. One of them is going into a book, which we talk about in the first part of the podcast, that concerns how humans make decisions with respect to our animal cousins and how we have the ability to look at our emotions and react to them or not, and how this plays into our conception of free will. Really interesting stuff, and I think it's the first time that we tried to play with the concept of God on this show, which is don't hang up, don't leave. We're trying to actually rationalize this concept and make sense of it, and this was really interesting. I don't think that Arnie expected to get into a conversation about God on this show, but anyways, eventually we move on to physics, and Arnie presents a really cool physical conception of how magnetism works inside of lattices. Inside of atomic lattices. And so I was really excited to hear this conception. It's very much in line with some of the ideas that we've been working on here over at our Material Atomics channel.
And just in general, Arnie is our type of guy because he's thought a lot about various scientific questions. He's thought about the philosophy of it, the practice of it, the intersection between the craft and the human experience. And so it was one of those rare conversations where it feels like we're just exploring the space of possibilities with someone who has thought a lot about it. And so that was really fun.
And I think that it's really, really stimulating as a scientist to get engaged in other creative pursuits, because it takes you out of the gear lock that happens when you bash your head against a problem over and over. And so you see that a lot in science, and I really appreciate it when I see a scientist that's also sticking their hands into other creative disciplines. I think that there's a lot to be gained by doing that. Anyways, if you enjoy the conversation, please share it with somebody. Leave us a comment, tell us what we can do better, tell us who you want us to talk to.
And if you really enjoy the conversation, consider joining our Patreon. We're at patreon.com/demystifysci. As a benefit of membership, you get all of the episodes early. You get both episodes for the week on Saturday morning, actually, or Saturday, depending on where you are. You get them on Saturday. And then you get to hang out with us once a week on Sundays. You get to join our patron-only Discord, and so you're connected to other people that have deep questions about the nature of the universe, and you get to support our mission of exploring the limits of human knowledge and one day funding it. Enjoy the show. We'll see you next time.
The scientific revolution starts now.
The DemystifySci podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
I love doing the orchestration too myself. The way that I experience it is by multi-tracking lots of different instruments.
Exactly, yeah.
But it's interesting too, because that's such a isolated activity where you're in a room by yourself doing it. Do you do any kind of conversational music? Do you play with other people at all, or do anything like that?
I mean, I have over the years, for sure. I don't do a lot of it, and I haven't actually done it for a while. Mostly it's like me at the piano or composing or stuff like that. But I love it when I do it. It's amazing. It's amazing to be able to do that with people, and it's a beautiful experience. So again, it's another thing I don't do enough of, as much as I'd like.
Yeah, that's one thing that I regret about living way out in the middle of nowhere, is there's just not the same kind of musical communities around here to have those kind of conversant musical experiences. But
yeah, it's interesting that there's nothing quite like moving out of the cities that makes you rediscover why people moved and why people invented cities in the first place.
Yeah, the whole tertiary thing.
Yeah, you spend a season or two out in the country, and all of a sudden you realize just there's many good reasons to move into a dense area.
Yeah.
Where are you located at physically?
I'm in Irvine, California.
Oh, okay. Oh, really?
So right in the middle of Orange County.
Oh, nice.
Are you from Southern California?
I mean, I'm originally from South Africa, but when we moved here 30 years ago to the States, we moved to Irvine specifically. And then I moved up to LA. I spent 11 years in LA as well, and then I moved back down to Orange County.
What brought you out there?
The entertainment industry. I worked there for a while.
Oh, cool. What were you doing?
I started out, I was pursuing filmmaking and screenwriting and all that kind of thing. And a friend of mine started Wire Image. which is a digital photo agency. And when they started the video division of that, I came in and I joined him on that. So we did a lot of entertainment media related stuff, a lot of red carpet interviewing, stuff like that, which was interesting for a while, but got boring after a while. And then we did some just general video production, content production work in LA. We did all sorts of interesting little things. I mean, we even did some consulting for one of the presidential campaigns in '08. So I got to, we got to interview a past president. And just all sorts of things. We made a TV pilot, which got picked up and was, continued on at NBC with other people. And so we just did all sorts of things. So it was a really great exposure to the industry. Learned a lot about myself as well. Really also helped me focus my thoughts because, I have lots of interests. I have interest in the arts. I have interest in the sciences. Love teaching, love writing. So it's been actually, I'm very grateful that I've had different opportunities to do different kinds of things. And now I'm really happy that I get to focus on, the science research and the writing that I'm doing because I'm very passionate about both. And, to me, those are the contributions. I think it's important that we have a rough sense in our mind of what the contributions are that we want our life to be about. I don't know how many people think about it or whether people think about it enough. But to me, that's the whole ball game, like why we're here. And what do we want to accomplish? So,
well, yeah, like in some very real sense, that is the afterlife, right? I mean,
we were just talking about this today.
We were just engaged in a very deep conversation this morning about this. But what does it mean when you pass from this world and something lives on after you? It's very much in the footprint that you've made in this world and the interactions you've had and the work that you've done. It's hard to physicalize the concept of afterlife much more than that for me personally.
And you have to prepare yourself for both ends of it, right? Because I think that we ended up at this conversation by way of power, right? Because we were talking about fame and influence and the way that you have to prepare yourself to have a spotlight turned on you, which I assume that when you worked in Hollywood, that was probably something that you had to encounter a lot, where you have regular people who just launch themselves into the stratosphere and then they become cult-like figures. And someone who isn't prepared for that is going to be completely washed away by it, the same way that someone who isn't prepared for death is going to be washed away by getting sick.
Yeah, no, that's true. I mean, I wasn't really in the spotlight. I was behind the camera more, so but I saw a lot of that, and you see how people handled it. And I don't know, it's difficult to be a celebrity because you have no privacy at a certain point. You can't go anywhere without people inundating you. And it might sound cool to people on the outside, but once you've had it for a long time, I think it gets really old really quickly.
I think it probably gets sold after like a month.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's funny. People have, we idealize everything that we don't know about, or everything on that the grass is greener on the other side. But then when you go there, you realize like everyone's just a normal person. Everyone's just dealing with their own stuff. No matter what context you do it in your life, you face the same challenges everybody faces. Just, that superficially they may look different.
Yeah, it's just so strange that it's natural to aspire towards greatness, but the consequences of achieving greatness are often unravel people to the core.
Totally.
It's a very paradoxical situation that we find ourselves in.
And also, if you're aiming at accomplishment, you get to a point where you don't. For some reason, the two things, the fame and death, to me, are tied together somehow.
Well, how do you can't prepare for either one in some sense. I mean, you can prepare, but ultimately, both are surprising. I think to an extraordinary degree that you could have never imagined. And isn't this kind of who's the philosopher that we had on the show a couple years ago, like right at the beginning, who was talking about transformative experiences?
Agnes Callard.
No, the other lady from Yale.
L.A. Paul.
L.A. Paul, yeah. This philosopher L.A. Paul has written a good deal about how she has this model where it's like, if you're given the option to turn into a vampire, would you be able to make a rational choice about it? And the idea is that you really can't, because you have no idea what it's like to be a vampire before you decide to become one. And so you don't really have the ability to choose these things. Your best bet is to just be aspirational and hope for something better at all times for yourself or of yourself.
Yeah. And to be the best yourself that you can be and not want to be somebody else.
Yeah, that's the tricky part. I mean, even just doing small time media, like our tiny little channel, there's always the push to do what people who are listening want to see, right? There's always that tendency if you're doing any outward facing stuff, like, and you see it really derail a lot of projects, and it's a very real force that's out there. You know, you have to really just be sure that you're doing what you want to be doing, and that there's an overlap, obviously, with what the audience needs. But it's an interesting back and forth, even just on a small level.
Same as songwriting.
Yeah,
you have a preconceived idea of what's commercial, of what you should write, and then what people will like, and then sometimes it's really hard to find your own voice.
Yeah, even if you're in a room with like 5 people and you're playing like a tiny little gig, you can still feel this pressure to like conform to the expectations of the audience. It's a very, very spooky, uncanny feeling.
Well, I think that there's a fundamental human desire to be recognized for the things that you've done. Would we all agree on that?
Yeah, but there we have to be careful, because that's also tied up with ego and, self, your whole survival instinct, insecurity thing that of our biological side is like there's security in that. There's security in recognition, in fame, in money, and those kind of things. And I think a lot of times we don't realize that that's the motivation. We put a spin on it.
So I think that those are really tied, right? Because if you're recognized for what you do, there's all kinds of different things that come with that recognition. It's not necessarily that you're going to get millions of dollars. It might just be that the people who are in your town notice that you've done something. But I do think that it's a fundamental human need to be seen for the accomplishments. I've never met anyone who's able to do stuff and just...
Well, it leads to a lot of bitterness, right?
It does.
Like, we encounter that all the time in science.
Because I don't think that there's anyone who can commit themselves to a lifetime of creating stuff, whether it be songs or scientific theories or meals or whatever, and do it in perpetuity without any kind of recognition from the audience of, I liked that.
So I sometimes think about that. It's like if I was given a choice saying, you can, the animal in the mirror that I'm writing, those human biological evolutionary ideas, like if you could get those ideas out into the world and really have the world changed and positively impact, but nobody would ever know that it was you who did it, would you choose that? Or would you choose doing it and having the recognition, but having it not make as big of an impact? And I like to think that I would choose the former, but our ego wants the latter. So it's a tug of war, on the inside.
Well, there's a lot of benefits just very tangibly in your life for having it be recognized, right?
Yeah.
I mean, at the very least, I don't know about you, but I am constantly worried about money. And that's obviously something that's really stressful is, can I afford to blank, whatever it is. I need this, I don't know, even if it's something silly, like I need this new pedal for my guitar rig. Well, can I afford that? So it would be, of course, nice to not have to worry about these things, no matter who you are. The problem is this compounds into greater and greater needs, and at some point it gets away from you.
Yeah, because so there's the lifestyle creep that's inherent to any number of success. So let's say that because if you do something, I assume that there's a reason to do stuff that does not emerge from the desire to be recognized, right? There's the initial moment of will. I have an idea.
And I want to share it with people. And
I don't think that that's driven purely by ego. I think that can be excitement, that can be joy, that can be playfulness, whatever.
Or to do good, to contribute, yeah.
Or to do good, yeah, exactly. And then what happens afterwards is that as you're doing the thing, there's that play that starts to play out on your head of the way that people are going to start to react to you once they see the thing that you've done. And that, I think, is what creates a fracture that you then have to spend a lot of time fixing, because you have to find a way to do the good thing without ever looking at that picture of what people are going to do in reaction to it.
Totally.
And that's really hard.
And I do think we have both inside of us. It's kind of like it's a gradient. It's from one extreme to the other and everything in between, like the pendulum. So yeah, I agree. I agree that we're, inherently have this capacity for good and for doing what's right and what's helpful and what's compassionate and what, elevates the world and people. But our biology is an insistent chemical force on the inside, and it's constantly going to be trying to corrupt that. So that's why I think it's so important to know that that's happening, so that at least you have a chance of recognizing it when it pops its head up and you can push it back down again.
What do you mean by that being the hallmark of our biology?
Well, so we are a biological mammal. We're an organism that has chemicals and neurotransmitters and hormones and all these things. And we have a fight or flight response, and our DNA is programmed to survive and to reproduce itself. So we are very much a biological animal. I believe we also have capabilities that rise above that, that we can, revel in abstraction, and we can rationalize and reason about things as well. But like ultimately our survival instinct is our most powerful programming, bar none. It drives us to survive. It drives us to stay safe. It drives us to reproduce so that the species will survive. And it's so primal and so imperative on a cellular level that I don't think we like to think that we are these sophisticated beings. So we don't like to acknowledge the extent to which our biology, is pushing us in one direction or another for reasons of security and survival instinct and safety. We dress things up in so many levels of rationalization and justification to make us feel good about ourselves, because feeling good equals feeling safe. And so that's two of the ideas that I write about in the first chapter of The Animal in the Mirror, which, as I mentioned to you guys, isn't quite finished. So I hope to have it out by the end of the year. But the first idea is based on this biological, operating system that we have. I think people misunderstand what emotion is. I think people think that emotion is something, you think about things and then you rationalize about them, and then you decide how you're going to feel about it, and then you feel about it. But that's exactly the opposite. Emotions are instantaneous. They are reactions to input from your surroundings, and they're designed to tell your survival instinct whether the input represents any danger or whether it represents the absence of danger. That's it. And it lets you know that based on how it feels. So any emotion that feels good is telling you that there's the absence of threats, and any emotion that feels bad is telling you that there's some threat, whether it's real, whether it's only even perceived only. It feels bad in order to motivate you to do something, to change, to get out of it, to get into a safer thing so that you can get to feel good again. And I think people misunderstand that's what emotion is. It's not an intellectual higher thing. It's a very visceral, animalistic impulse, which animals share with humans. They just might not be able to, rationalize about it like we can, but they feel it because it's part of the survival instinct machine. And the parts of the anatomy that cause it, we share with animals, and they do each, the amygdala does the same job in an animal that it does in a human.
So the striving for success is to the point of making yourself sick. Is this striving for survival mechanism playing out, essentially? Yeah,
because money and power represent safety. Which is
what about like drugs?
So that's a good question. So drugs, like all things that are mind and mood altering, that give you pleasure, dopamine rush, are designed to anesthetize your negative emotion, to make you feel safe. That's why people take it.
Foods too, right? I mean, any sort of addictive situation.
Food is pleasurable. It has a pleasure of taste. And anytime your body feels pleasure, any physical pleasure, whether it's sexual, whether it's food, whether it's anything, it tricks your mind into feeling safe, because feeling good, positive emotion, equals feeling safe.
The paradox here is that feeling good and doing good are not necessarily the same thing.
I would say that doing good actually doesn't actually feel very good a lot of the time.
Oh, come on.
Well, no, I mean just in the process of doing it, right? So if you're a firefighter who's running, like a firefighter who's running into a burning building, or exercise, fine. Both of those things can be deeply unpleasant in the moment of doing. Like but
those are the things where you're not actually doing it for the sake of your personal survival instinct. Those are the selfless. We are capable of rising above that and doing what's good and selfless, right? But that's not what your biology tells you to do. That's being. Actually, it's a very interesting point. You got to be careful when you talk about it, because animals can risk their own lives for their children also, right? Mm-hmm. And you can argue very clearly that's a survival instinct issue. The survival of the group depends upon the survival of the majority or survival of the children. So for someone willing to sacrifice themselves for the survival of the group could equally well be seen as part of this biological imperative that the group should survive. So it's very difficult to talk about real
bugs do it for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, can you give us a 30,000-foot view of what you're trying to do with Animal in the Mirror?
Sure. It's very simple. I believe that most of the dysfunction that happens in the world, whether it's in our personal lives or in our society, comes from us acting biologically, acting from a place of survival instinct, looking for that security, that sense of safety and security to soothe our innate mortality and our vulnerability, because we're mortal. We can be hurt, we can be killed, right? So we don't realize the extent to which everything we think and do is filtered through that lens. Everything we think and do is designed to make us feel safer. It's not designed to be smart necessarily. That's the level of the biology. Now, we are capable of rising above that, but if you don't know that that's what your machine is doing, then you can't really rise above it effectively. And this brings to the other point that I wanted to say, which is what free will is. And I think this is such a beautiful and such an important distinction. When I was doing the research for this book, I found this really cool research done in the 80s and 90s in the Bay Area by a researcher named Benjamin Libet, I'm not sure how you pronounce it. It's fascinating. He wanted to look at what free will is. So he put people in this environment where they could, choose freely, and they had electrodes measuring their brainwave activity. And they found that when people made a choice that they thought was a free will decision, the brainwave activity that was building up to that moment of decision began seconds, even up to 10 seconds before they became aware of even wanting to make a choice.
Wow.
So his colleagues said to him, you see, that proves that we're biological automatons. There's no such thing as free will. It's an illusion. And he said to him, no, you don't understand free will. Free will doesn't mean plucking an idea out of thin air. Free will is veto power over an emotional impulse. That when your survival instinct is prompting you to do something to make you feel safer, first you have to recognize that it's happening while it's happening. Most of us don't. We tell a story, we justify and rationalize to make us feel good and right about our choice so we get to feel safe. But if you really listen closely and you understand how your biology works, whenever you're feeling prompted to do something, you recognize what the subconscious fear is that's prompting you to do that to make you feel safer. And at that point, you have free will, because at that point, you can choose to veto that impulse and not react to try and soothe your fear, but rather to act from a place of ideals or a place of choice, or, to be the kind of person that you aspire to be, rather than, living out the biological imperative. That's the definition of free will. The definition of free will: veto power over an emotional, fear-based impulse. So that means that while we all have the capacity for free will, the vast majority of us are hardly ever using it, because we think we think we're using it. We think that every choice we make is, we have a story that we've told ourselves to justify why we're right and they're wrong. So, but that's an illusion. That's just a safety-seeking mechanism. If you really get that, what the fear is, and it's hard to start to remember to do it at first, but once you start doing it, it's not really that hard, because our fear-based survival instinct is very simple and predictable. You can clearly see what the fear. If I don't want to rock the boat at work, it's because I'm afraid I might get fired. If I don't want to talk back to someone, I'm afraid because maybe they won't like me. And if maybe they don't like me, then maybe I'll get ejected from my group, and then I will not in group, because we are afraid, and our survival instinct is what runs us on a visceral level. That makes us group thinkers, because there's safety in numbers, just like the prey animals out on the Serengeti. We need to be part of a group in order to feel safe, to feel protected. So therefore, once we're part of a group, it's not just enough to be part of the group. You have to conform. You have to uphold the dogma of your group, because if you don't, the group might push you out for being different, and then you'll be alone and without the protection of your group, and your survival instinct is not willing to risk that. That's
a really legitimate thing to be afraid of, because there's not much success available to you if the entire group turns on you. Right? Because I think that you can make the case that if your group turns on you, you can go find another group. But we spend a lot of time talking to people who have turned against the group, right? They're people that have struck out on their own. They have their own ideas. They have their own vision of the world. They don't have many friends. They're islands, and they're not successful. They've refused to conform to the group, which I understand that impulse to the depth of my core. For some reason this has come up over and over and over again this week, but I encounter a group and they think I belong to it, and my first instinct is to back away and be like, no, there's been a misunderstanding. And so I understand the desire to get away from the group and to not conform, and yet it seems impossible to survive without conforming somewhere, somehow, knowing how to play with people, knowing how to be well-liked, knowing how to succeed inside all of these networks of human interactions.
Yeah, no, of course you're
is
right.
vital, right?
Of course you're right, because we are that biological animal living in a world of limited resources and competition. We do need to be part of. You're absolutely right, but to me, the important thing is to recognize what that group thinking imperative fulfills in us instinctively and why we need it so much. You know what I'm saying? And the fact that we all look for a group, meaning, it's easy to look at religion and say that's the most powerful groupthink because it had the answers to the biggest, most confounding questions.
They have the biggest house too,
and everything, right? But political partisanship is just as big of a groupthink. Any sports fans, that's another level of the same kind of idea that. Why would fans in the stands get into a fist fight over who won and who lost? It's ridiculous. It's because
we're stepping down in power, though, in this, right? Because you go from the church to the state to the sports team, and at each level of those, it becomes less pressing. People's allegiances become less pressing.
Yes, I would argue that religion and politics have swapped places in the modern world. I think religion has lost a lot of the power that it used to have just by virtue of the modern world that we live in, which is very secularized. But there's always going to be something that's going to take its place because people's survival instinct need it. And to me, political groupthink in this country right now is so visceral and vehement that I don't think people realize the extent to which they're playing out their fear-based survival instinct. They don't realize that it's just it's an instinctive preference that makes you go to the left versus to the right. Neither one is better than the other. They each only half the story. We need, in fact, both in equal measure to have a healthy society. You need the compassion of the left. Beautiful ethos. We need that, absolutely, right? We have to look after the vulnerable. We have to protect one another. But you also need a sense of personal responsibility and self-reliance and not be a burden on other people. You've got to generate and take care of yourself in the world and protect people. And so, if you go to either one of those extremes without the other, it'll lead to evil. It'll lead to groupthink. It'll lead to persecution. It'll lead to hatred. So
100%.
That's the irony of politics in this country, is that as long as people insist on going to one side or the other, they'll always only ever have half of the story, but be completely convinced that their half is 100% right and the other side is 0% right. And that'll never lead to peace and cooperation.
Well, fear is one of those emotions that leads us around. I think it's really interesting, speaking of religion, that the early pagan traditions, I think they captured this knowledge in their superstructure.
Which knowledge, sorry?
The knowledge that we have emotional programs that run autonomously unless we intercede. So if you look at something like the god of anger or the god of love, whatever god you want, it can be understood that these gods represent these autonomous programs that will get away from you. If you think about like the last time that you got really pissed off at somebody, it happens before you have a grip on it. Like you were saying, it's happening before afterwards you might try to rationalize it, or you might even have a great rationalization you come up with depending on how intelligent you are and how good you can argue. But at the end of the day, it happened to you before you were aware of it. And so I guess the final trick is how to strengthen your will. If this is all about will and the ability to exercise your will over these autonomous programs,
100%.
What are your options? I mean, music's a great thing, right? Meditation. I know some people love meditation, sports, martial arts. There's all sorts of different ways to train the will. Do you have any perspective on strategies for that?
Well, the actual strategies, there's all sorts of things out in the world about different ways to approach it. But to me, the gateway to all of them is first recognizing how the system works, because I think most people are in denial about it, about the biological truth of underlying our behavior. Most people I think, seem to operate in the world as if they're convinced that we are already evolved, sophisticated, free choice-making human beings, that are evolved and spiritual and all that. And I believe that we're capable of that. But that takes work. That takes intention. And first and foremost, it takes being able to acknowledge what this biological operating system that's installed is actually making you think and do. Because if you don't know that, then it's much harder to rise above it. Because then it's like you're walking in the dark. You don't, you know what I mean? You can't see the path clearly. I mean, seeing what it is and seeing the path clearly doesn't necessarily mean it's that much easier to get a handle on all of our weaknesses and things, because, like you said, Anastasia, the biological truth that we are a biological organism, and you can't deny that. Sexuality is a good example. It's a chemical imperative. It's animalistic. It's designed to make the species survive. But does that mean that we need to eliminate it from our experience? Of course not. But what it does mean maybe is that we need to at least put it in a context that's at least serves us a little bit better as a more sophisticated being. Put it in a healthier context. Actually, maybe another example is eating food, right? You could argue that that's completely animalistic and biological. If you don't eat, your body will die, right? So the question is, but there's ways to do it which are indulgent and selfish and overeating and all, eating for pleasure. You can abuse food or you can use it, you can eat in a healthy way. If you can have delicious food, but you can have, portions that are healthy. You can make the meal an opportunity for communing with other people. You can do it in a way that's more animalistic, or you could do it in a way that's less animalistic. But unless you know the difference, unless you clued into the distinction itself, I think there's a limit to how far we can evolve unless we know what we're working with. And I don't think people want to see it because it makes them feel unsophisticated.
I mean, obviously, government and science are two aspects where we strive for objectivity and rationalism. We want to be able to make decisions not emotionally. But it doesn't seem possible, right? The way that things have played out in both of those worlds lately seems to be based on emotion, not based on a purely thought-out perspective.
I mean, I think that I may have mentioned this last time we spoke, I'm not sure, but I think that science and journalism are perhaps the two fields where people are least able to see their own bias because they believe that they are in a field which is about objectivity and fact and truth. And therefore you want to see yourself as being objective and factual and truthful and not susceptible to bias. And therefore you don't want to see your own bias. And that's a very insidious form of it.
I don't think that people who are in these fields don't see their own bias. I think that they think that they're right.
What do you mean, right?
Well, I think that they have constructed a view where they recognize that their view is biased, but their view is biased because it is the correct way to be biased.
Give us an example.
Like somebody who works for MSNBC and is telling everyone that if you get the vaccine, no one will get COVID again and it's going to be over. That person genuinely believes that that is the truth. I don't think that they're lying. I don't think that they're
but are they biased?
I don't think that I think that they recognize that they might be over-representing the case, but they justify it to themselves because they believe in what it means to over-represent that case.
The emotional...
I think you're being charitable. I think you're being charitable there.
I think that's the only... I think that that's a virtue that is necessary in the world in order to be able to solve the human-animal question. The lion is not charitable.
No, that's true. That's true. But I mean, I'm not convinced of that. I think that they honestly believe that their perspective is the healthier perspective and the correct perspective. And that is a bias.
It is a bias, but it's like, is the Christian biased? Is the Christian who believes in their Lord and Savior Jesus Christ biased into thinking that Christianity is the best religion?
Of course.
Let me put it another way. Every human being is biased. It's just a matter of degree. So the question isn't whether or not you're biased. The question is, A, how badly are you biased? And B, how aware are you of your bias?
Okay, is there an unbiased human possible?
No, I think it's only possible in theory.
Okay, well, so then that's then I think
what
that
we can do, ideally, by recognizing our biases, is we can design our tests of our understanding based on that, commensurate understanding of our own biases. That's the hope, anyway.
I don't know, because look, hold on a second.
Well, that's no. To some extent, people do that, right? That's why if you look at the court system, it's a great example. You're not allowed to have conflicts of interest in the attorney side of things, right? With the whole idea of conflicts of interest is an attempt to screen out biases.
That's true, but I guess what I'm trying to draw attention to is that there are underlying philosophies that you cannot disturb without breaking apart the entire cohesive network of people. So if you go and you start to undermine people's belief in their values, because that's a bias by our definition, right? You have a value, you think that this is the correct value, and you will go out into the world and you will act in accordance with that value. And somebody comes around and is like, that value of yours is a bias and you should look at the world in a different way. What you're going to do is you're going to unravel the fabric that binds people together. Because the biases are there to tribalize people and to group them and to identify one another and to create cohesion. Because without the bias, what are just a bunch of Spocks? Who?
Yeah, but the other side of that is those groupthinks, right, have led to the biggest perpetration of evil and mass murder in the history of the world. All wars have been fought in the name of people's groupthink.
And that's the crazy thing, because I'm not 100% sure that you can get rid of groupthink. I think that if you...
And again, and I'm not saying that you should get rid of it, just like I'm saying you shouldn't stop eating, just like I'm saying you shouldn't involve with sexuality. These things are part of the natural human experience, and we're in this world, and this is the world that we're in, and that's fine. The question is, are we going to be going through this process with a self-awareness and with a motivation to try and elevate ourselves and our consciousness and that of the world, or are we just flowing along with the river, or just being taken along by this biochemical current, oblivious to the fact, yet convinced that we are making intelligent and evolved decisions, but we're not. All we're doing is making the decisions that make us feel safe. Again, I don't want to give the impression that we are 100% biological and we're not doing anything more, because I don't. I believe there is a spectrum from extreme. On one end, there's people operating 100% on their selfish, self-centered, self-serving biology, and on the opposite extreme is that theoretical construct where we have completely subverted our biochemistry and we're really doing what's good and elevating the world. I think both of those extremes exist in theory. I think all human beings are somewhere on the spectrum in between. And I would argue that those people like Napoleon and Hitler and these short, insecure individuals, right, who felt that the only way they can feel safe is by literally dominating to the extreme all other people and literally killing all of those that are in a different group, because that's the only way they can feel safe in the world. That's an extremely biological and low level, selfish, self-centered way of being. And then you have your Mother Teresa's, your, fill in the gap. There's plenty of people in the world also that seem to be a shining light of overcoming your biology and being selfless and trying to elevate the world. And most of us are somewhere in the middle,
I think I've just become aware of why I think science is so important. People have asked me this for a long time, like why I even care about obscure theories about cosmology. And I think it comes down to believing in our inherent ability to intercede on these emotional level statements that somebody else would impose upon you otherwise. Because the cool thing about understanding, which is really what science is about, is that it comes from you. You can see the mechanism and you decide whether you buy it or not, and that's it. There's no authority structure interceding and telling me that this, supernatural event went down this way and I just have to accept it. I can look with my own eyes and I can take control over my perception of the world that way. And
agreed. And that's what the scientific method is meant to do, right? Is to sidestep our bias. That's what it's meant to do. Just like in America, this constitutional representative government of the people, by the people, for the people is meant to sidestep that the move towards tyranny. It's meant to sidestep corruption. But in practice, neither of them live up quite to their potential in that regard, because it's being done by human beings that are constantly corrupted by their selfish, self-centered biology, which is entirely steeped in fear. So there's plenty of examples we could talk about in science where the scientific, ideal is not upheld. Where people subscribe to a certain theory dogmatically, and they will not listen to anything that questions their preferred theory. Same thing in politics. Nobody can argue that politics has successfully, eliminated corruption. Nobody is going to argue in America that the richest corporations don't have the strongest political voice by virtue of the amount of money that they can literally spend lobbying and have laws passed that uphold their profit structure rather than doing what's actually for the good of the people. I don't think anyone's naive enough to think that that we've reached the ideal to which our constitution has aimed, because our nature keeps getting in the way. Doesn't mean we mustn't strive. I think our form of government here is a really great step in the right direction. I think the constitution is a beautiful vision, and hopefully one day we'll be able to live up to it and really embrace equality and freedom and equal representation, and constantly close those loopholes that allow for corruption to creep in, but it's a process.
It seems like there's a sort of inevitability to the cycle of corruption and tyranny and collapse that happens over and over again. If you look at the history of almost every country other than the United States, they've been through this cycle more than once. Where
it's our biology. That's the reason.
Yeah. It just seems kind of natural. I guess it's a bit tragic because we've never been through a collapse in the United States, and so
Depression.
Well, we haven't had a change of government, let's put it that way, in any
Civil
real
War?
meaningful sense. Sorry?
Civil War?
Well, they tried, right?
Yeah.
But I wonder, we're so optimistic here that we'll be able to repair the ship while it's sinking, whereas history, unfortunately, would suggest that usually the ship sinks and you get another one. And so,
this is the first time that we're living in an age of information and international instantaneous communication and all these kinds of things. So, if there was going to be a time where we have a chance to break the cycle, hopefully this could be it. But the way things are going in the world, we're constantly being reminded of the extent to which people act from this place of fear and selfishness. And yeah. I think I'm optimistic as well. It may not sound like it by what I'm writing about, but the reason that I'm writing this stuff is because I think if we see it, if we recognize it for what it is, it allows us to evolve more quickly and more efficiently. I still believe we are evolving as a species. If you look at the last 1,000 years or 2,000 years or 500 years even of human history, we're getting better. There's more clean water, there's more legal representation for the underprivileged than there ever was throughout history. There's more equal rights across gender lines, across racial lines, across religious lines than there ever was in the past. We're not at the destination yet, but it's getting better. So I think we are moving in the right direction, but I think that it's very slow and painful because our nature is holding us back. It's like a gravitational force holding back the rocket. We've got to keep firing that engine if we want to break free of it. So I think we are moving, but that's why I'm writing about this. Is I want to just try and accelerate the process. And to me, understand like this metacognitive way of approaching it at least gives us a foothold. If I now, every time I feel a negative emotion that's prompting me to do something, if I have the wherewithal to stop and say, hang on a second, okay, this is my fear of this, trying to get me to do this so I'll feel better. Is that really going to take me where I want to go? And then at least I think about it and I stop and I pause. Now, I may not yet be in a place where every time I do that, I make the right choice. But at least I'm in the conversation, which I think allows us to move more quickly than if we weren't in the conversation.
I mean, I think that most of the people that I encounter on a daily basis, I have yet to meet someone who doesn't realize that they're ruled by their reptile brain and are completely driven by these impulses. And I think that what people are most preoccupied by is the difficulty of doing better. Because, look, when you're sitting in front of somebody and they're being a dick, it's really hard to not be a dick back. That's how the world works. Like when somebody's doing wrong by you, your immediate impulse is to do wrong by them. And to be somebody who's able to step outside of that and to abandon the reptile brain and to be able to do the right thing, I think that that's the...
It's a sacrifice.
Well, it's a sacrifice, but it's already, I think, an aspirational goal for lots and lots of people.
I agree with you. I think we're living in this age of this awakening of consciousness, of higher consciousness. I really do. Like these conversations happen so much more than they ever used to before. That's because we're living in this connected information age, this communication age. So people have more access to information. People have interface with one another more. So I agree with you. I think a lot of people today are aware of those things. I also think it's tied to culture to a degree. You know, there's some countries where maybe it doesn't happen as much as in others based on pre-existing culture, degree of technology, degree of free markets, degree of education. These are variables, and different cultures will be on this road at a different rate, and the goal, the hope, is that we can all reach this same destination. We're all earthlings after all. There's no lines on the map when you look from space.
Is there go ahead.
I was just going to say, on one hand, it seems inevitable. Like, even if this time around the civilization wheel doesn't work out, at some point, if we're going to advance, we have to move past this issue, right? People have to be able to not act based on fear, even when they're receiving information that makes them. They have to be able to sit back and reckon with things. And so,
well, if the Fermi paradox is an accurate readout of the contents of the universe, which I don't necessarily think that it is, but let's say that it is, then that would suggest that perhaps no one ever gets beyond their biology, right?
I have a slightly different take on the Fermi paradox.
Me too.
I don't know what you got in my novel that I sent you, but it's like I talk about it in there. And that is that, regular strength electromagnetic broadcasts of are not going to go on forever. To get a signal even from here to Alpha Centauri, you have to send a very strong, narrow beam, high-powered broadcast. Otherwise, it'll just dissipate by the time it gets there. Which means that if there are other civilizations out there that are communicating electromagnetically, we won't necessarily pick it up unless they are specifically sending us a high-powered narrow beam contact broadcast.
Yeah, I can't even get reception in town here. So I mean, come on, guys.
No, that's true. That's true. I mean, I think that everyone's on. It's hard to imagine meeting a person who isn't on board with mastering one's own instincts and becoming better than what we were before. I think that there's a lot of pessimism about humans, though. There's a lot of pessimism about the human project that I think
every movie about the future is a burning nightmare.
Also, I think it depends on who you're interfacing with. You guys are intellectuals. You interfacing with a lot of intellectuals on a daily basis. But if you speak to a family law attorney who's dealing with divorces and child custody issues on a daily basis, and who's seeing the way that these parents who used to love each other now are on opposite teams that are literally using their own children, the people they supposedly love most in the world, as a football, as a tool to hurt the other, that's 100% biology. That's not an intellectual, that's people succumbing to their groupthink baser nature. And as a teacher, you see the same thing. You see how many students do you teach whose parents are also separated, and who children don't have their book because it's at the parents' house, and this and that, like the parents don't. So there's a lot of that out there. A lot of the dysfunction, a lot of the clear dysfunction that we see in people's lives is coming from this biology. But yes, there are a lot of people that are striving. But again, even the intellectuals, even the scientists, there's a lot of the British, the BMJ, the British Medical Journal. I think they published some statistics a while back that I think 1 in 7 UK researchers have witnessed a colleague falsifying data in order for the sake of the outcome of their paper. And I think literally 2/3 of the biomedical journal articles that have been rejected from the BMJ were rejected because of fraud, not because of other reasons. That's reported by the BMJ themselves. So again, it's like, yes, there are plenty of people. That's why I say it's a spectrum. Half the people are maybe slightly more than 50%. Half the people are going to be less than 50% of this, what's the impetus that's really driving them. I'm just trying to move the needle by having these conversations more.
One of my favorite vices on the internet is the subreddit Am I the Asshole? Which is where people will post stories of terrible things that they've done, and then the community will judge them. And it really, first of all, I'm always shocked by how crazy people are. Where I don't know how reliable the stories are. It's the internet. You can say whatever you want. But the community always judges accurately. There will be some dissenting voices, and there are some edge cases, but generally people have a really good sense of when somebody's in the wrong and how to behave. And I'm always...
trial by jury is a good reflector of this.
I agree. And don't get me wrong, I'm not pessimistic. I'm not saying we're all just animals. I'm saying, yes, a lot of us are striving. And I would also argue, though, that in that subreddit is attracting an audience of people that are in the conversation already. But yet if you look at the number of people that are in that subreddit versus the rest of the people on social media as a whole, it's a drop in the ocean.
Yeah, I think it's just really hard to be good all the time, right? You get tired, even if you're striving and you are concerned yourself and you try to be self-aware, things happen, you get sick, or you didn't get enough sleep, or you're stressed out because you have to do whatever it is you do that's very difficult at your job. And it's hard to keep up with the metaphysical side of things.
Totally. Don't let me paint the wrong picture here. I'm not writing this book because I've mastered this stuff and I'm like so evolved. Like,
no, I get it.
On the contrary, I see exactly where all my issues are. I can see exactly what my vices are, and I know why I'm doing them. I haven't stopped doing them all. But to me, at least stage 1 is like, okay, at least I'm aware of what I'm doing. At least I'm aware of where my dysfunction is. At least now I can try and work on it, like maybe more efficiently because I'm looking at it. But I think there's still too many people, not saying everybody at all. I just think there's still too many people who don't see it for what it is, that are deluding themselves to think they're already making informed, free decisions from an evolved place because that's what makes them feel safe and justified and everything. But they're not really, they're deluding themselves. We're all deluding ourselves, just a matter of degree.
No, I get it. I've seen this play out where people, and I think I've said this myself when I was younger too, is, well, that's just how I am, right? That's the one you hear all the time, where like somebody's, you're in some conflict with somebody, and
I don't think I've ever said that.
Well, you're a better human than me. But yeah, it takes a lot to move yourself into, if you're in that mindset, it takes a lot of ballast to switch your camp to, all right, that's how I was. Maybe I can be differently, actually.
Yeah.
It's interesting because over the course of my life, I'm slowly starting to swing over to the other side where I'm like, maybe I should be saying that that's just how I am. because I suffer from this, and I don't know if it's femininity or if it's being the middle child or what, but my entire life has been defined by people from the outside being like, you shouldn't do that, and me being like, yeah, you're probably right. Whoops. And then like figuring out how to adjust for that and how to change, how to figure out how to fold in the fact that you've done something really screwed up and figure out how to make amends for it and move on. And now I'm gotten to the point where I feel like there's a place where you get to where you do have to figure out how to take a stand, But you have to take that stand. I've heard Jordan Peterson talking about this, where you have to take a stand where it feels like the thing inside of you is a solid core.
Yeah, you have to be true to yourself.
And true to yourself and true to beyond yourself.
To what is good
too.
in yourself, right? I mean, if there's all this good and evil inside of each of us, you have to be careful which part of yourself you're being true to, I guess.
Right? Do you know Bernardo Kastrup?
No.
He's an analytic idealist and philosopher, and he was on the show a while ago, and we were talking to him about the nature of the self, and he made the point that it's necessary to embrace the evil within yourself and to accept it. And I'm not really on board with that. Like, I vehemently disagree with that.
Well, can I put a different spin on that for you? What is the definition of good and evil? I think as soon as people hear the terms, they go religion, spirituality, God, devil, all that whole conversation. But to me, that's not it at all. Good is that which allows us to coexist peacefully and respectfully. That is the side of us which is striving to be our higher self. Evil is what I was explaining before about the Napoleons and the Hitlers of the world, is those people that are coming from a completely biological, animalistic, afraid, self-centered, insecure place that makes them act selfishly in a self-centered way, and that hurts other people. So evil is that which we do which hurts other people for the sake of our own selfishness. That's that's our pure survival instinct biology. And good would be the opposite extreme, where you are subverting your biology in order to do what's really an elevated thing. And it's a spectrum of degrees in between. So really evil is pure physicality, and good is the degree to which we exercise free will, our veto power over that fear-based impulse. So I think that's a very pragmatic way of looking at good versus evil.
I think harm is important for sure. I mean,
that's what plays into this exact definition, right? The harm definition was one of the first social psychology definitions of evil, is that which harms others.
I mean, it works most of the time. Obviously.
Well, this is Jonathan Haidt's work, I think.
Exactly. Yeah. Great book.
Do you know? I told you about this. Why good people are divided by politics and religion?
Yeah. I was just thinking of there's cases in which you might harm someone that wouldn't be evil as well. They're extreme cases,
like
right?
Self-defense.
Yeah. Or family defense, maybe even country defense. Right now we get into some weird territory all of a sudden where it's like, well, they want to have slavery in the South. Maybe we should hurt them.
I don't think you can argue that self-defense is evil, because you could argue that, to defend yourself against someone evil trying to hurt you is, what else are you going to do? Lie down and die.
Yeah, so there has to be like a justifiable harm component to it, where harm is justified at times. I'm really struck not just by the fact that harm is justified sometimes, but by the fact that there's not like chimpanzee Stalin. There's only human Stalin. Do you know what I mean by that?
Yeah, animals are not malevolent. They're just, predatory for eating purposes.
Yeah, and so there's something.
Well, they're extraordinarily mean to one another for sure. There's
sometimes.
You should watch some of these anthropologists studying these chimps. They're crazy. They'll murder opposing tribes and eat their intestines out of their bodies, and it's unbelievable.
That's pure animalistic groupthink. You know what I'm saying? It's not that they're not evil. It's they playing out their biology.
Yeah, there's something about them.
Instinct.
But there's also the survival instinct comes against the other. They're not doing this within their own group.
They'll sometimes if there's somebody threatening their dominance hierarchy or something like that.
I guess that's true.
But humans have the unique ability to organize extraordinarily, right? So we can
send out leaflets and to have underground meetings.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, and we can use technology and we can use abstraction. Yeah.
So,
but people then make the mistake of thinking, oh, we're sophisticated and animals are nothing. I don't think people realize that animals, because emotion comes from survival instinct, and the anatomy that governs survival instinct is identical in humans as it is in animals. That means that animals experience the exact same emotions that humans do. They may not be able to rationalize or justify or, act on them the way that we can, but they feel them.
Let's unpack that for a little bit.
Place.
Yeah, let's unpack that, because I think that's a pretty That's a scissor statement.
It also gets at the heart of consciousness, right? Because it seems like there's this emotional consciousness and then there's also this rational consciousness. And I think the two get confused a lot in the scientific discussions. And if we're talking about animals having a lot of this emotional consciousness, but very little rational consciousness.
But even that is controversial because I think that in general, the science is still out on whether or not fish feel pain. You know, that's the level of the discourse in the academy regarding to the internal state of animals.
And there's also the encephalogical quotient, the EQ.
The size of the brain relative to the body.
And I think it's not just the size, but it's also the degree to which they can have like more sophisticated thinking. There's a whole hierarchy, you know, with like orcas and dolphins near the top, at the top, and you know what I mean.
But my sense of my sense is that our understanding of the brain and how that stuff works is so flimsy because the other day I read that you can condition a caterpillar to be averse to a certain smell, and then when it goes into its chrysalis, it liquefies and then reforms into a butterfly, and the butterfly is still averse to the same smell. Like, that doesn't make sense without a brain and without memories and without all of these things that the butterfly can't possibly maintain as its structure is dissolved.
I mean, you don't need to understand anything about a scorpion to run away from it.
But no, it's a smell that they're conditioned to be aversive to. Like, it's a smell that the caterpillar is conditioned, like, you pair a noxious stimulus with the smell, and then the butterfly remembers the smell.
But it has the same brain.
It doesn't. It literally liquefies.
It liquefies?
It liquefies inside.
I know nothing about butterfly biology. I'm sorry.
Okay, so the caterpillar inside the chrysalis liquefies. It turns into goo, and then it reforms into a butterfly.
Outta here.
I'm serious.
No, but it has the same DNA before and after, which isn't that amazing that the DNA, it's not only the DNA for a caterpillar, it's also the DNA for a butterfly and the DNA for the conversion process.
I know, it's amazing. Michael Levin is having a field day somewhere. But that's what I'm trying to say is that, look, Shiloh's looking at this.
Fact check on aisle 6. Yeah.
My point is that our sense of this brain hierarchy where, okay, if you have a big brain and it's got a bunch of folds in it, that means that you have complex cognition is, to me, a pretty superficial frame based off of the surprising things that I've read about in terms of cognition and awareness and response in animals that don't have those kinds of brains.
No, but the question is like the Pavlovian response and everything, to be able to to condition an animal by using stimulus, etc., etc. So does that imply that it's a higher human type level of consciousness, or is that just it's part of the way the biological machine works? When you experience something unpleasant or dangerous, you remember to avoid it in future.
Sure. I always wonder about it in context of our cat, right? Because she doesn't have that many neurons. I think that Shiloh always compares it to the number of neurons in the human intestines. She's about as smart as your guts are. And it's obvious that she's dumb when I see her next to a dog, because there's a bin of food in the kitchen and its lid is broken, so she could go up to it and she could lift the lid off. But she never does. And the dog shows up, and 5 seconds later, the lid is off, and the dog is eating the food. And there's obviously a limit of abstract ability that is different between different animals, but I always struggle with figuring out, is it because she doesn't care? Is it because she wants me to do her bidding and open the bin and get the food and set it out for her? Or is it because she's too stupid to know that it's there?
I don't know.
What did you find out?
Well, I can't get to the bottom of it. I still don't. I'm not swayed yet.
But what was you were making an argument about the way that the brains are organized between the different animals and the sensation of emotion, how that reflects on cognition.
To me, the argument is an anatomical one. You know, the same anatomical structure in a cat is going to do the same job as that same anatomical structure in a dog or a cow or a human. The spleen does the same thing. The liver does the same thing. In the brain, the hippocampus and the amygdala, they're going to do the same thing. That's their job.
At what point do you lose those structures?
That animals experience emotion.
But not all. So are we talking all? I don't know enough about animal brains. What are there? Do all animal brains have the same collection of structures?
I'm not an expert, so I wouldn't say that they all have the same ones, but I know that mammals have mammals have a cerebral cortex like we do. It's just not nearly as developed as ours is.
Particularly the neocortex, from what I understand.
Right.
I wanted to say there's something also interesting about this too that I realized when I was studying a little bit of neuroanatomy a couple years ago, that there's a lot of decision making being made outside of the brain, actually. Particularly evident if you were to, say, grab a hot plate and drop it. That's a decision that's made by your spine, actually.
Right.
And I think there's a lot of decisions being made down in your guts as well, right?
If I remember correctly.
So there's more to this than brain on some level. The fact that we say I have a gut feeling about this is rooted in some real phenomenology, I think.
Oh, did you look into the microbiome stuff at all when you were developing this?
No, not really.
Because I know that there's stuff with microbiome as to depression and mood.
I'm starting to look into it in terms of myself. I've just found a really cool prebiotic, probiotic product, so I'm starting to try and get my gut biome healthier. But I haven't studied it that much. No.
Interesting.
Yeah, it does seem it's hard to unpack the associations that you experience in your own life, but. Because I don't know whether I've been really stressed out in my life before, and my guts have been really messed up at the same time, and it's like chicken or egg, which one? I don't know.
Yeah, I think there's a huge connection with the gut biome and the rest of our health, which I don't think mainstream medicine has given it its due yet, and I think there's more and more coming out about it. Something I read recently, something that 70% of our immune system is gut biome related.
That would make sense. I mean, that's
the principal way we encounter the environment. Yeah.
I remember what was really surprising to me was when I realized that the gut microbiome produces serotonin and dopamine.
Oh, really?
And GABA. It's producing neurotransmitter. The bacteria themselves are producing the neurotransmitters as a side effect of their metabolism.
I think they're precursors, but yeah, it's important.
Medicine is so fascinating.
They produce precursors, yeah.
Almost went to medical school.
I believe so, yeah. Yeah, I almost did too.
Did you really?
I'm glad I dodged that bullet personally.
I wouldn't have wanted to because you can't really do other things if you becoming a doctor is kind of all encompassing.
Yeah, and they just seem so beat down. I found myself at a few different doctors' offices this last year, and it's just kind of depressing. You just realize these people are just so tired and.
Gut bacteria manufacture 95% of the body's supply of serotonin.
Oh, directly?
Wow.
Directly.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I'll be curious about more on that. That's cool. Yeah. I mean, medicine's incredible. I would love to be able to do medicine. I wish I had time to know how to perform surgery, and it would be super useful.
It would be very, very useful. But that's kind
of the doctors that I know, that's all they do. They don't play music. They don't have a podcast. They don't do anything. It's just...
And not being a doctor, but from my limited exposure to it, I think the medical sciences have the same challenges that all the other branches of science have also. There's dogma, there's the way that things are done, there's being closed to certain ideas that are different. It's challenging. It's difficult.
Yeah, and there's even less time probably to investigate those ideas. I encountered that a few times during the pandemic, just interacting with family members that are doctors and being like, hey, check out this study, and they just don't have time. They're like, whatever the CDC says is fine by me, because I can't be bothered. I don't have time.
And that's the other thing that kind of ties it all together, like the science, the politics and everything. People, we really want to believe that the CDC and the FDA and all of these federal, institutions that are supposed to be looking after our health, that they really have our best interests at heart and etc. But they're just human beings. It's an organization of human beings, and human beings are innately susceptible to self-interest, to corruption, etc., especially when these agencies are related to multi-billion-dollar, industries. It's just very difficult to maintain objectivity and idealism and all these kinds of things in that kind of an environment. So one has to not, just believe that, everything is in the ideal, because, we can strive for the ideal, but, too often we fall a little bit short of it. And I think it's important to just have a sense of a reality about that kind of a thing, just so we can keep a balanced view. And, It's too easy to be, oh, this is true and that's false.
But if you imagine large-scale change happening with just something, I shudder to use the word spiritual awakening, but
Oh no!
but like an awareness, right? You're talking about a heightened sense of awareness of your own emotional pre-programs before.
People are always accusing us of being too new age.
Yeah, well, sorry.
No, I
but
think it's yeah.
But how do you enact such a awareness, a change in awareness without an ideology? Because it seems like ideology is the only thing that unites people into changing their behaviors, for better or for worse. Usually for worse, but it seems like
and that's what we were saying earlier. It's like you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. You can't say that all groups and all group association is bad, because it's part. It's like saying that, you know, marriage is that basic human group in order to ensure that you have someone to help you, protect you, and that in order to help you procreate. But that doesn't mean that marriage is innately bad. It fulfills an important biological imperative that we have, but it's not bad in and of itself. But to believe that it's all good and with no biological imperative is also naive. So I think it's important to see where our biology compels us to do certain things, and where within that construct we can still elevate our experience and elevate our consciousness while being true to our very nature.
I think that has to come with consequences. Like, I think that the reason that religion is so successful at getting people to sign on to an ideological point of view is because there's consequences. If you don't do this, you'll burn in hell for the rest of eternity. That's a pretty strongly motivating aspect, especially if you believe in it as a real place that you will one day go to burn for eternity. That's
but then again, that's fear, using fear as the motivator, right?
And I think that that's really, really important, because it seems to be that fear is a really effective motivator, and something
the most effective motivator,
right? Because
there's no contender.
It is our most powerful programming.
And
Absolutely.
so maybe what the goal is to not to rationalize the fear, but to choose which things to be properly afraid of.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Because there's this thing called like the self-authoring program, and it's a
We better be getting a paycheck from Peterson for this episode.
We were talking about him earlier today too. It's so have you listened to much Jordan Peterson?
No, actually I haven't, but I haven't.
He's a very difficult figure. And I have a lot of really complicated feelings about Jordan Peterson, but I will say that I think that he is really he's spot on about needing to aim for good and needing to use fear to motivate that. Because what he has this thing that he developed called the future authoring or self-authoring or something like that. And it's basically a program where you write to yourself in 5 years, and you write a version of what you would look like if all of your dreams came true in the next 5 years. And then what you do is you write what it would look like if you failed in all of the ways in which you know that you will always fail and that you have always failed before. And it is a shockingly effective method for sitting down and diagnosing your own raw failures. And then the next step is, okay, well, what are you going to do to avoid failing in the exact same ways that you have failed countless times before?
That's interesting. I have a similar thought about that. And my thought was, that kind of part of the reason I left Hollywood, and I hit like 40, is I was been there for a little while, and things were starting to happen and moving in a good direction. And then I started to think to myself, if I stay here for the rest of my working career, what are the chances that I'm going to be able to really make things that make content that matters and make content that changes the world? And the truth is, the better you know Hollywood, the more you realize that it's not just about being talented, it's also about being lucky. So no matter, there's plenty of extremely talented people in Hollywood that just never get into the position to have creative control over a project and everything else. And I realized that if I want to, am I willing to risk all of those years of creativity to hopefully get into the position to make a a loud noise about something worthwhile, or do I want to go and do something useful every day? And the way that I thought about it was, if I'm lucky enough to live to be 80, that means I'm halfway through the game now. And when I'm dying and looking back over my life, what do I want to feel when I look back in the mirror? And to me, it's like it's really important to me that when I'm looking back over my life, I feel like I didn't waste it, like it was worthwhile. I made a contribution that was worthy of me and my abilities. And I could think of nothing worse than getting to the end of your life and realizing that you'd failed to do that you'd wasted all of that time and all of that opportunity. That must be the most awful feeling. So then to me, that refocused me in a way that I need to set about living my life on a daily basis, that in such a way that when I get to the end, I will be able to look back with pride on what I've done. So it was similar to what you're saying. It's that fear of living a wasted life, on not living up to my potential, that made me want to live up to my potential and to do things, so that I didn't feel that way at the end.
I think the ancients would call that the fear of God right there, essentially. Which is reasonable, if you take the perspective that God is sort of the consequences that will come, from your actions, but also just from being a fragile being in this very chaotic universe.
Or just from the thermodynamic reality that there are consequences to actions. Like, it simplified my life a lot when I started looking at God as consequences. Where it's like, it's not necessarily some like creature that sits in the sky, but it's the fact that, my mom would always tell me the story about how when she was a kid, she lost her house keys by dropping them in the outhouse, which again paints a picture, mom's at an outhouse as a child, because and her dad at some point, and she told her parents, and she had to make up some story because she was going to get in trouble if they knew that she lost the keys, because she was always losing the keys and it was hard to get keys. It's the Soviet Union. And then, like, a couple years later, he digs out the outhouse and he finds the key. And of course, she gets in trouble at that point. And that was the central story that my mom used to always drive home the fact that you never know where the consequences are going to come from, but they will come. And I think that is as close to God as I can imagine existing. It's the fact that thermodynamically there will always be some day where you will have to pay back what has happened.
No, I have a slightly different view on God. It's kind of funny even to talk about it in this context of science, because I try to respect my mind as being scientific, and I try to think of things in a scientifically defensible way as well in the universe. But that's kind of like another concept. We didn't get to talking yet about cosmology in the beginning of the universe. There's a kind of it goes into that conversation. But to me, like, if we are talking within the construct of religion or spirituality, or certainly what they teach, most of the religions that believe in the Old Testament, it says God breathed the soul into man and he became alive. So that means that the soul is a piece of God that he breathed into people, that consciousness, that spiritual, if there is a spiritual essence that animates us, it's literally a piece of the ultimate spiritual reality, which is God. But the people don't take that to its logical conclusion. If that is true, then that piece of God, whatever it is inside each and every one of us, animating us from the inside, which means that God is experiencing what we're experiencing firsthand. There's no separation between us and God. And that's one of the problems I have with organized religion, is it becomes this groupthink dynamic where you have to jump through these hoops. You have to believe this, you have to do this in order to have a relationship or a connection with God. And in my opinion, the connection is innate. Everything in the universe is energy that's animated from the realm of wherever energy comes from, and there's nothing that's separated from it. It's impossible to be separated from it. So that's the problem I have with organized religion. The parts of religion that I like and that I accept are the ones that they all have in common, which is the spiritual side of it, which, it's the groupthink parts that put us against each other, which is not in any way divine, in my opinion.
Well, Go ahead.
Well, there's certainly a rational argument to be made that the universe has organized a pair of eyeballs strapped to some legs that are sitting in this chair right now. You know, it's hard to imagine that I happened without the entire universe conspiring to make that happen. Now, whether this was an accident or not is sort of beside the point, but everything certainly collaborated in the production of these experiences that we're having right now.
And you can't cheat the universe, right? You can't win against the house. And I think about that in terms of economics, I think about that in terms of physics, I think about that in terms of biology. All of these things have a set of rules, and there's a confinement on them that prevents you from going beyond that set of rules. And this maybe goes back to what you're talking about in Animal in the Mirror, which is that until you can figure out the rules, you don't know where the confinement is because you're inside of a dark room and you have no idea if what you're touching is the wall or if it's just a post in the center of the room.
Okay, so let's talk about the beginning, right? Because that seems to be a place where religion and science clash, unnecessarily, in my opinion. So this is one of the issues that I have with the Big Bang Theory. Well, aside from the fact that it violates the laws of physics, because we live in a universe that's causative. Like the conservation of matter and energy is the foundation of science within which we operate. So that means if you take that to its logical conclusion, the origin of matter and energy is beyond the purview of science. We don't have the tools to apprehend the question. We can only deal with the existence of matter and energy and the conservation of matter and energy, but we can't deal with the origination of matter and energy in science. And it's disingenuous for us to even try. And this is, I think, where a lot of people go into the mist, as John likes to say. And that is that the Big Bang violates the laws of physics. It violates causality. It violates all sorts of things, right? I think the reason that so many scientists for so long have just taken it on hook, line, and sinker is because it's a satisfying creation story. I don't think they even realize that that's why they're doing it, right? But
it was invented by a priest, so maybe be wise to that.
Right, there you go, George Lemaitre, right?
It's also it's such a powerful story. You know, it's the idea, you hear people talking about the predictive power of the theory, and it's literally saying that you can take every molecule in the universe and trace its path back to an origin, which is the equivalent of saying that you've melted an ice cube and you can trace every molecule of water back into the original place where it was in the ice cube.
But it doesn't answer the question. They're still kicking the can down the road. What caused the beginning, and then what was there before that? You know, at a certain point, you're leaving causality. You're exiting the universe.
I think that's the most annoying part, is that the assertion that breaking physics is okay, which is becoming an ever increasingly popular thing to do inside of science. I think that's the most disturbing aspect of it.
And that's the human groupthink that's creeping into science. That's where that illogic comes in, because you can't bear the thought of not, whatever it is. But so I have a slightly different take on the beginning of the universe and the extent of the universe. I believe that the reason that we can only see 13.8 billion light years in any direction, by the way, right? So that means that the Earth would have to be at the exact center of the universe, of the Big Bang, what are the odds of that happening? So,
well, the idea is half-baked, but it's that the space between the Earth and everything else has expanded over time. Which
they have a justification for why it's not geocentrism.
I don't think it's a great explanation. But
yeah,
they have argued this. Yeah.
Well, it's because I think that the idea is that no matter where you stand and look, you would only be able to see 13.8 billion years.
No, that I believe in, but that's because that's the limit of the perception when you're using photons to see. But that means that there is really no boundary to the universe. It just depends. There's only every observer will have a 13.8 billion light year sphere around them, because that's the limit of the distance that you can see using photons, because photons they lose momentum very, 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 very slightly as they travel vast distances across space-time. So the universe, in my opinion, the resolution to this question is, I think, a very satisfying one for both the scientist and the religionist, in my opinion, of course, just my opinion. And that is that I believe that the universe is infinite in space and in time. and therefore we don't, as a scientist, you don't have access to the beginning, to a non-causative beginning, and all you have access to is observation now and extrapolating what you see through observation. We can extrapolate what we see backwards in time, but the Big Bang doesn't do that. It does the opposite. It creates this construct, this dogma of a beginning constraint condition, and tries to extrapolate it forward. But you can't extrapolate it forward with any degree of confidence if you're dealing with something whose very properties and nature violate the laws of the scientific method. How do you extrapolate that forward with any degree of confidence? So I believe that the universe is infinite in space and in time. So in order to apprehend the question of the beginning of the universe, you have to have the integrity to say, I'm now stepping outside of the bounds of the scientific method, because the scientific method can't apprehend that question. I'm now stepping into the bounds of philosophy. Now, in a philosophical construct, I can now conceive of saying, if there is a creator that created the universe, that creator must be outside of space and time, because space-time is the created thing. So if there is this creator that is outside of space and time, surely it doesn't seem to be illogical to me on a philosophical level that the creator could create something that's infinite within space and time, but having created it from outside of space and time. So that solves both problems for scientists and for spiritualists. The universe can be infinite in extent and in time, yet still be created by a non-causative origin that's outside of space and time. And for the scientist, it frees them up from having to address the question at all. All we have access to as a scientist are the dynamics of the universe that we can observe. And that's what we have to work with. It's unsatisfying in that it cannot answer the original question, but that is because that question is necessarily outside of the construct of science. And we have to have the courage and the honesty to acknowledge that.
And going back to your first point about the light losing energy, I have noticed that the word universe has a changing definition. I've been talking to we've been talking to more and more astronomers this year, and, reading the textbook, I've noticed that the word universe in astronomical terms is now being defined as all that we can see. And so if you hear an astronomer talking about the birth of the universe, they're really talking about the inception of what they can see, which is a very different concept than universe meaning everything in existence or something like that. And so it's very interesting looking back over the history of the acceptance of this expansion idea and the Big Bang, because prior to really the widespread acceptance didn't happen until very, very late, actually, in the 20th century. But prior to that, every single scientist accepted an eternal universe. They were very staunchly set against religionists who were advocating for a creation moment. And it took really the detection of the CMB for most astronomers to come over to the side of the Big Bang cosmology. So it's a relatively modern idea in a scientific sense, which is quite interesting. But it also, like you said, there's I don't know if you said it, but
they chose to interpret redshift and the microwave background radiation as proof of what they already were believing, that there was a Big Bang, because there are other explanations of both of those two phenomena that do not violate physics. So to me, that's a far more plausible interpretation of those pieces of evidence.
Yeah, let's talk about that. Can we talk about your tired light idea?
Also,
the tired light's not my idea. I think many people have spoken about it, but Viv Robinson talks about it in his book, and he actually does a calculation and he comes up with. Sorry, Anastasia, you were going to say something?
I'll get to it in a minute. Okay. Go ahead.
As far as Viv Robinson explains, as far as I understand the concept, the cosmic microwave background radiation has a temperature of 2.7 Kelvin. That is the equivalent of the rest mass energy of a neutrino, 10 to the negative 4 eV over c squared. So Viv contends that the rest mass of cosmic neutrinos is what we are seeing. It's this, we live in an electromagnetic universe. To have this base line static of electromagnetic energy at 2.7 Kelvin is not a stretch. And if you take the density of cosmic neutrinos throughout the universe, every cubic centimeter of space has something like, 10 to the 12. There's a huge number of cosmic neutrinos, which have a de Broglie wavelength that's meaningful. It's like a millimeter or maybe even 2. So that means that if you think about that, the entire universe is nowhere empty of neutrino density. It's a subatomic particle with a half integral spin. So there's this background matrix, if you will, of neutrino energy everywhere. That's one interpretation of the CMB. It's not the only one. Eric Lerner has another in his book, Big Bang Never Happened, where he talks about the high energy electrons being ejected from nuclear cores. Then when you have the magnetic fields, galactic magnetic fields, that trap these high energy electrons, and they get absorbed and re-radiated, which randomizes their direction, just like a fog, will scatter light so that it looks like when you're looking at a lamppost near the ocean on a misty night, it looks like the light is kind of blurred equally to be coming from multiple directions. But that's really just the randomization of scattering that's taking place. And he has a very interesting paper. He made a prediction that if that is the case, that it's happening in intergalactic space, then we should observe that certain distant objects that will be equally bright in infrared are going to lose intensity in the radio spectrum with increasing distance, which is in fact observed. He wrote a paper about that. I link it on one of my blog posts on my website, arniebenn.com. I wrote a blog post about this stuff. I think it's called Redshift Expansion, God, and Mr. Bang, or something like that. So I have a link to his article there. So there's at least 2 explanations of the microwave background radiation that I know that don't require us to violate the laws of physics.
Our friend, do you know Pierre-Marie Robitaille?
I've heard the name, but I don't know him.
Yeah, he's a good friend of ours. He's absolutely convinced, and he's quite convincing in his presentation, that the source of the CMB is actually the oceans on Earth, and that the satellites that were used to measure it away from Earth were essentially calibrated to look for a narrow band that they had already established right here on the planet. And he's an interesting dude. Yeah, I highly recommend his work. He's got a lot of work on the sun as well, because of course something that plays into this is whether or not a gas, because obviously in the early days of the universe, we're talking about this radiation being emitted from ionized gases, whether a gas is capable of producing a black body spectrum or not. And it doesn't seem like anyone on Earth has ever taken a gas and produced a black body spectrum from it, even though most astrophysicists would tell you that the sun is a burning ball of gaseous plasma. And so Pierre's entire basis is rooted in the idea that the sun cannot possibly be a gas, actually, and that it must be actually treated as more of a liquid of some sort.
The plasma.
Well, plasma is a tricky word, right? It's kind of one of those words that can mean anything you want it to. If you read a plasma textbook, you find out there's liquid-like plasmas, there's gaseous plasmas. It's not really one state of matter. And so, yeah, anyways, so there's a lot of interesting ideas out there about what the CMB could be. Some of them cosmic, some of them not cosmic, but
right.
That was a very, very crazy publication, because I think in the same publication that the data was announced about the CMB, the discovery of that radio signature.
Later. It wasn't in the same one. We looked this up a while ago. It was like 6 months later.
I don't think so, but we can figure this out. The interpretation of it was in a subsequent article. I think it was literally the next article. So the first article reported it, the second one interpreted it as cosmic in nature, essentially.
You mean Penzias and Wilson when they discovered it?
Right. And
but they already believed in the Big Bang. They were looking for evidence of the Big Bang theory, weren't they?
Well, I don't know about that, but I do know that that conclusion was established very, very quickly, right? It wasn't like people were like, oh, there's this weird microwave signature. What the heck could this mean? Is it cosmic even, right? There wasn't much time to sit around and ask those kind of questions. It was just immediately, oh, great, this is the smoking gun we've been looking for. Right. So there hasn't been a lot of effort dedicated institutionally, at least, to investigating alternative explanations for what this microwave background could mean.
Right, because there's an existing dogma that they like. which is
Well,
unscientific. And it's so interesting to me now with the James Webb Telescope, with all the things that they're discovering now supposedly at the very edge of the dawn of the universe. They've now found these 6 galaxies that were fully formed, 13.5 billion years ago, which they shouldn't have had time to form to that degree of maturity if the Big Bang theory was correct. So it's interesting to see now how people are scrambling to, well, it's because of I want to see now whether people are going to start realizing more and more that maybe there's a flaw in the theory, or whether they're going to be scrambling to tweak the theory to accommodate the fact that to come up with some new explanation for why it was possible for these, galaxies to form that soon after the Big Bang.
Well, if you want to replace the Big Bang, you have a pretty big job ahead of you, which is you have to explain some very bizarre features that are optically apparent at long distances, right? Like this redshift business or the CMB, like you have to replace it with something that's more satisfying to people, or at least more convincing.
If light loses energy very gradually to the viscosity of space, if it loses momentum as it travels to the viscosity of space, that's a perfectly legitimate explanation. It's going to be an effect that's linear with distance.
If you believe that light is obeys material dynamics, right, which doesn't seem to be the case. This is why I'm so worried about these. Physics doesn't have to convene on material explanations, because most physicists are like, yeah, light involves one atom and another atom. But what happens in between, we were talking about this with John yesterday, what happens in between is sort of not spoken of. It's like, well, it just gets there. And it's like, well, what is happening? What kind of deformation of what substance is occurring during that transactional process? And if you don't concern yourself with that, then these kind of answers that, like the one that you're giving with viscosity losses and so forth, just seem nonsensical, because you're not considering a mechanical basis for it in the first place.
I mean, to me, the burden of proof is on the other side, is because, like, in terms of like a perpetual motion machine that's perfect and never loses energy, are we saying that that's what photons are? Are they perfect? They never lose energy no matter what. So no matter how far they travel, they go through space. To me, that's more of a stretch than the fact that they are going to be interacting. They are going to be scattered. They are going to be moving through electromagnetic disturbances. They're going to, to me.
Well, the scattering is accounted for, right? That's the troubling part, is that the mainstream astronomers, cosmologists defend against tired light theories by saying that if the light loses momentum, it's going to do it through scattering effects or through electromagnetic interactions or something. But those produce dispersive effects. In other words, different wavelengths are reddened, whereas others aren't reddened, but the signals are reddened across the board. And so you're looking for a kind of loss that's not easily seen at short length scales here on Earth. It's something that only occurs over vast, vast reaches of
It's such a tiny, tiny effect.
Right. So I think it would be brilliant if somebody could figure out a way to demonstrate non-Doppler based redshifts in a laboratory somehow. Is there a way to show that this phenomena occurs even on a very small scale, even the tiniest bit, that it can be demonstrated somehow? I think that would be the coup. Likewise, with the CMB, if you could demonstrate for sure that the CMB came from neutrinos or came from the oceans or whatever it is, if you could come up with an experiment that showed that for sure, then I think these pillars, because the Big Bang is really only standing on like two main pillars, right?
Right.
So it wouldn't take much.
Well, also, I mean, if it loses like 0.0007% or whatever it is that we've calculated for every 100 million light years, it's very difficult to test that in a laboratory that's, the size of the Earth. I'm speculating here. I don't know.
Well, maybe you could set up I wonder if you could set up a resonating chamber, though, right? Where you have mirrors and you have some wave system inside of there, and you could give it some initial energy and have it reverberate and see. You'd obviously have to calculate its losses to heat and everything else, but if it did lose energy and you could actually peg that to the amount of energy you would expect to be lost in these 14 billion light year red-shifting phenomena, you might be able to demonstrate that. And it seems like a pretty cheap experiment if someone was very clever and could pull that off.
No, I'm not sure how that would be done. That's probably above my pay grade.
Yeah, me too. But, you know, I don't know. I still got a few years left in me. So, I really want to build a radiometer, by the way. If anybody's listening and wants to help, I would love to be able to measure the CMB here at home and take it into different places and begin to study it. I've seen a couple of build-outs that people have shown on the internet where they use PCs and some very cheap components to build a radiometer that's capable of measuring the CMB, and I think that'd be a good place to start.
By the way, Penzias and Wilson did print in the same journal as Peebles, Dick, and Wilkinson about the interpretation of the Big Bang, but they published together. So it was really one project that was published by two groups.
Yeah. I guess I'm just trying to say that the conclusion was baked into the announcement.
It had already been theoretically proposed almost 15 years earlier. And so they were searching for something that had been proposed.
Gotcha.
They found it. This other group interpreted it to be the thing that had been theorized beforehand, and then they published it all together as this big thing that helps knock steady state over once and for all.
Yeah, no, don't buy it.
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky. I think you guys covered a lot of the things that we tend to end up at when we have this conversation, right? Because we talk to a lot of people that are very much interested in seeing these conventional ideas at the heart of physics fall, because it seems like it's holding things back. It's preventing people from being able to ask fundamental questions. And I think that Shiloh's right when he says that you have to give people something that they can replace it with. And eternity is... Lemaitre said that he chose a birth of the universe because eternity was too difficult for the human mind to comprehend. And...
yeah, I think that as scientists, we have to be mature enough to say when we don't know something and don't have a way to know it yet.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah.
Yeah. I forgot I was going to make another point.
Epistemological, is it epistemological humility?
Epistemic humility.
Damn it. Yeah, I was trying to explain this to my class this
Yeah,
morning.
I remember what I was going to say.
Sorry, kids.
Yeah, to me, science has to be intuitive, though. You know, it doesn't mean that the math has to be easy, but the physics has to be intuitive. Meaning, I can explain to somebody what a sphere is. They may have difficulty understanding the equations that represent a sphere geometrically, but the concept of a sphere is perfectly intuitive. And I think science has run into that problem when we've gone so mathematical and esoteric on these things that can't be measured, and then you hang on to that as a dogmatic thing without being able to explain an intuitive physics. So to me, if physics can make sense, then the places where we can't, we could say, well, we don't understand that yet, but rather than making something up that we can hang our hat on, electronics, 100%, Maxwell, solid, we're engineering with these things, we have done for many years, but, the far reaches of the cosmos and the deepest, sub-quantum depths within, atoms, that's where we need to have a little more humility as scientists.
Yeah, do you have a sense of when things went off the rails, like what it was that led to physicists even entertaining the outrageous idea that physics just breaks down sometimes? Like how did that happen?
I think that has existed as long as human nature has existed throughout the history of science. Meaning, okay, think about this, right? Human beings do not apprehend a new or a foreign concept in a neutral way. If it's different or new, we come at it negative. We don't come at it open and objective. We think that we do, but we really don't. And if you look throughout the history of science, Boltzmann, Avogadro, all of these, Einstein, even when Einstein came out with his general theory of relativity, he got a letter from 100 scientists explaining to him why he was wrong. 100 of them. And Einstein, I think, famously said, well, because it took 100 of them to write this letter, I know I must be right. So, like, human nature has always been to resist the change in the dogma. So it's nothing new in the modern world. We just, people tend to think that today we really know and science knows, but back in the past they didn't really know. So it had all these misconceptions. But human nature has been standing in the way of progress in science, and it still does.
But this introduction of irrationality into the reintroduction of irrationality, like the reintroduction of non-physicality into physics, that was a discrete thing that happened in modern times. That's very
You mean
strange.
with the Big Bang?
Well, with Big Bang, dark matter, black holes, dark energy, I mean, I could just go on and on. The idea that physics just breaks down at some point, and that's okay, and we move on and we incorporate that into our model of the universe, and
That's
we
always
don't.
going to be the case, isn't it?
I hope not. I hope that we at least have the epistemic humility to, when we encounter something that looks like it doesn't make sense, that we can just say, well, we don't understand how the centers of galaxies work. In fact, we don't understand how galaxies stay together in general, and we're working on it. Like, I don't know why we can't move into that phase of humanity.
This comes back to the human-animal question, right?
Exactly, right. It's because we want to be right. We need to be right in order to feel safe. We need to believe we're right. Right. So I think we make the leap. We come up with, well, we don't really know. So let's conjecture. Well, it could be this. This is an interesting conjecture. This is but then you get your favorite conjecture, and then you start to believe, that it's the truth. And I know that I fall into this same trap myself. I find Viv Robinson's theories incredibly compelling when it comes to the way that protons and neutrons bind to form a nucleus, the way that it accounts for radioactivity and the formation of nuclei, the way that it accounts for gravitation. It makes sense. It's intuitive. It all hangs together. So therefore, I find myself choosing to believe that is the truth of it. And then one has to be careful, because it's a compelling theory, but it's not demonstrated absolutely yet. It seems to be able to account for what's observed, but not proven. So it's a very difficult thing to guard against that, just like it is in all areas of our human nature. We want to feel safe by knowing where we stand about everything, and it makes us feel unsafe if we don't. We feel like there's unanswered questions.
Yeah, it's almost like, as a scientist or an artist, you have to really embrace the idea that your work is something of a mandala that's going to be washed away eventually. Like, no matter how brilliant your theory is, and trust me, I love coming up with theories of nature, and I love to believe that I'm correct about them. But I also have to recognize that no matter how good the theory is, something better is going to come along eventually. Someone's going to figure out a better way to describe or simplify or unburden, or they're going to find holes in it, right? This is how science works, is we're constantly updating our understanding of nature. There's really no end to how well we can know nature.
Right. That's why I respect John so much, John Williamson, because he's so good at qualifying the theory, where we're at, where we aren't. I suspected it could be this, but obviously I could be wrong. I mean, he says that so many times. I really respect that.
Yeah, it makes him a real joy to talk to as well, because
he is remarkable.
He hears new ideas. Like, we'll throw some ideas at him, and he's one of the few physicists that I've talked to who doesn't immediately try to correct you by saying, well, that's not how people understand it, and break it down for you.
Not even that, but sometimes you'll say something to someone not in the exact words that they would use, and their immediate response is no.
Even if they mean yes.
Even if they mean yes, right? There's this processing thing that they go through, and then at the end of it, after 5 minutes, they're like, well, yes, I suppose.
Well, they don't even say yes, I suppose. They'll just reformulate your own idea in their words and then move on.
But John didn't do that.
He didn't do that. Yeah, he's such a joy to talk to.
Yeah.
So I wanted to go back to this concept. You mentioned that you kept speaking about humans in opposition to biology, which I think is a really interesting assertion. Because in some sense, if we as humans, the higher self is interceding in our animal instincts, in our biological imperatives, what does that mean about what we are? What does that say if we're outside of biology to some extent? Is that how you look at it? Do you see us as outside of biology?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that we are our biology plus this ability to, I don't know, connect to a higher abstraction of consciousness or whatever you call it. It's always weird to juxtapose this conversation with the scientific one, because but again, here we are as scientists saying we're stepping outside of the bounds of science, and now we are entertaining some philosophical ideas. It's interesting when it comes down to the purpose of the universe. People always often thinking, why we're here? What's the purpose of the universe? To me, I look at the design in order to try and divine the intent or the purpose of existence. Look at the way that it's, if there is a designer, if there is a creator, it's made on purpose this way, because that's the way it wanted things made. So therefore, what does that look like? Well, it looks like here we are, this consciousness, this capable of abstraction that is now thrust into this virtual reality meat suit for X amount of time, and we have to operate under its default programming and try and rise above that programming through an act of will. Like, to me, that, which is not that foreign, this is philosophically very similar to what a lot of religions teach about the purpose. We're here to elevate ourselves, elevate the world, learn, grow, etc. So I do believe that that's the case. I believe that if there is an intent and a creation behind this in this universe, the purpose would seem to me, based on the design, to be our intention is to override our default biological, selfish, self-centered, animalistic programming that's hurtful and evil, to rise above it and express a higher level of consciousness and good thereby, and that's a challenging process because we're fighting against this resistance, this tension of our inner nature. So that must be the purpose.
Yeah, I don't think it's out of place. I don't think this conversation is out of place in science, not necessarily because I want it to be inside of science, but I think that the world has forced this conversation into science by eliminating our reliance on religions as an organizing principle for making decisions in the world. So science seems to be the way that we make decisions collectively, that we understand the world, the nature and the world and human affairs. And so I don't see that there's really any other place to discuss such big, ridiculously big concepts as God.
Philosophy.
Well,
and science and philosophy used to be the same discipline. Right?
Yeah, I was going to say, we have doctors of philosophy, even though we clearly did science in graduate school. So I think of them as sort of as synonyms.
Well, that's why when I was saying earlier about the beginning of creation, that's why like you need science and philosophy side by side, because science will get you this much of the story and philosophy will get you this much of the story. They're mutually exclusive and complementary at the same time. They don't contradict one another. So you can have integrity and be a scientist and a spiritualist at the same time, because you are operating in two different constructs that don't overlap and can't overlap. And if you try to use one against the other, you're being disingenuous because they don't apply.
Well, science doesn't really have any information content about what is good or right or virtuous.
How to behave.
Yeah, it has a lot of... I think that it has a lot to say about, if you do this, then this will happen. But your values are the ones that decide whether or not the consequences is something that you want or not.
Yeah, science talks about the causality aspect, and then philosophy talks about the morality and the abstract elements. Yeah.
So what is your destination, do you think?
My intellectual destination?
Sure, yeah.
Well, like I mentioned earlier, to me, I view my life as what is the growth that I'm capable of as a person, and what is the contribution that I'm capable of as a person, and what do I want my contribution to be like for this life. So I guess I'm trying to engage in the things that make me feel like I'm going in that direction. The reason I'm writing The Animal in the Mirror, and the reason I wrote Evolutionology, the precursor to it, is because I want to have a positive impact on our behavioral consciousness, on our behavioral evolution and our evolution of consciousness. The reason I'm involved in scientific research is because I'm also striving to understand the universe, and like all of us, right? We want to know the truth, we want to know how things work. And if we can impart that information and share with others in a way that helps them elevate their understanding or promotes, increased tolerance and cooperation and makes the world a better place, to me, that's a life worth living, Yeah,
I think science really is a good pursuit in that it empowers the individual to the platform that they are capable of understanding something. And if you don't believe you're capable of understanding something, then you inherently can be manipulated by somebody else. And that's a really bad position for the elevation of the human race in general.
Yeah, agreed.
So maybe we can shift gears and talk about what you're working on with the Quantum Bicycle Society these days.
Cool. So the thing I'm presently working on is the periodic table that's on our Quicycle website. It's kind of a work in progress. I find I keep kind of adding to it. Right now, I'm working on adding more about, the physical, chemical, biological properties of each element. But the reason for putting it together was to try and visualize the atomic orbitals. And that whole foray began with trying to understand why oxygen as a molecule is so incredibly paramagnetic, why it responds so strongly to magnetic fields that if you pour liquid oxygen through between the poles of an electromagnet, they won't fall under gravity. They'll literally stick to the electrodes because of the magnetism. That was really intriguing to me because, according to molecular orbital theory, there are only 2 unpaired electrons in the oxygen molecule in the antibonding molecular orbitals. But then, some metals like manganese has 5 unpaired electrons, 5 or 6, chromium has 6, and it's not nearly as paramagnetic as an oxygen molecule. And to me, that there had to be more to that story. And also, so that's currently what I'm working on, is the magnetism thing. And it's really interesting that if you look, for those viewers who don't know what paramagnetism is, it's just when you have an unpaired electron and you apply a magnetic field, the electron is going to want to line up to the magnetic field. So if you have an atom with unpaired electrons in it, that atom will not only align with the magnetic field, but it'll become attracted into the magnetic field because you have field cancellation happening between the magnetic field, which lowers energy, so it attracts it in. Almost just about all the metals in the periodic table are paramagnetic because just about all of them have unpaired electrons. So what intrigued me the most is when you look at the D block, scandium, titanium, vanadium, chromium, manganese, iron, cobalt, nickel, etc. The strength of their paramagnetism doesn't go with the number of unpaired electrons that they have. Scandium has 1 unpaired electron, and it's the second most paramagnetic metal in the D block, the 3D block, which is fascinating to me. Then titanium has 2, vanadium has 3, but they're less paramagnetic, and that intrigued me as to why it is. So I started looking into trying to understand the geometry of those orbitals to try and see where those electrons are with respect to one another, and whether that geometry, whether the interactions based on their geometry could explain their relative strengths. And so that seems to be coming out of what we've been looking at. At least we now have a basis of a way to look at this geometry that seems to be able to account for that trend, which is kind of cool.
So what if I can summarize this correctly, maybe what you're saying is that the shape, the structure of those atoms themselves is what gives them the properties that we observe here, and not necessarily just the simple accounting of whether there's unpaired electrons or not.
Right. So it's not just about the number of unpaired electrons. It's about where they are with respect to one another and how they're interacting with one another within the atom and between the adjacent atoms that accords their paramagnetic strength. And then I wanted to look at ferromagnetism, which is the difference between the two. For those that don't know, is that if you take a metal that's paramagnetic and you put it in a magnetic field, all of the electrons line up and it'll get attracted into the magnetic field. But when you switch the external magnetic field off, then they'll go back to their random arrangements because they can't hold the electrons can't hold one another in line. But iron and cobalt and nickel are ferromagnetic, which means once you put them in a magnetic field and all the electrons line up and then you remove the field, they keep their mutual alignments, they hold each other in alignment, and that's what makes them permanent magnets. So I wanted to know what's the physics behind that? What's the mechanism behind that? Why is it that iron has 4 unpaired electrons and it's ferromagnetic, whereas manganese has 5 and it isn't? It's paramagnetic. What's the difference? It's not just the number of electrons. So what is it about the geometry happening within the iron atom? So I started looking into that a little bit more. And it's also part of the reason that I built this periodic table the way that I've done, to try and show the geometries, because electron geometries have to be symmetrical. So when I looked at iron, it's very interesting. Iron has 6 electrons in its 3D block. So it has a full 3s, full 3p, and then In the D block, it's got 1 pair and 4 singles. So I was trying to kind of figure out what's going to happen in those orbitals in order to make a perfectly symmetrical arrangement, and would that be able to account for its strong ferromagnetism? So we're all familiar with the concept of hybridization from the second shell, how the sp3 hybridization in carbon, makes a tetrahedral arrangement, right? So that's the s and the p orbitals get together to make this. It's not, the s and the p orbitals don't remain separate when they're in the second shell, when they're in the same orbital, because these electrons are in the same shell, so they're going to interact with one another. Looking at the single electron hydrogen atom and then extrapolating up to elements with multiple electrons, and they're not necessarily going to do the exact same thing. So when you look at iron, I tried all sorts of different ways of thinking about hybridization with the s and the p and the d orbital and how that might work. And I came up with a very interesting construct that involves PD hybridization, that the p and the d orbitals are not going to ignore each other when they're in the same shell. They're right there. They're not going to be superimposed with these different geometries. They're going to interact. Mm-hmm. And when electrons interact in the same shell, if they can pair, they will. If they have opposite spin and they can pair, they will pair. Because a dielectron, according to the whole theory that John and Viv and these guys have been working on, dielectrons are incredibly stable. They drain magnetic energy because they're anti-parallel. So they become very stable. So in looking at the third shell of the iron atom, if you look at the p and the d orbital, the p orbital is full, so that's 3 dielectrons. And then the d orbital has 1 dielectron and 4 singles. So if you combine them, that's 4 pairs of electrons and 4 single electrons. That's 8 electron domains. So I was trying to think of how that could be set up in the most symmetrical stationary wave structure, harmonic resonance structure. And this is kind of what I came up with just for those p and d orbitals in the third shell. Now you'll notice there's 4 green and then 4 clear directions here. Both of those are tetrahedral. There's a tetrahedral arrangement of 4 dielectrons and a tetrahedral arrangement of 4 unpaired electrons.
So just for people who are listening, he's holding up what looks like 2 overlapping tetrahedrons, which are symmetrically offset.
This would be a single tetrahedral arrangement in 4 directions. And this would be 2 of those that are superimposed through them, but in 180 degrees apart. So this is really a cubic arrangement. There's the 8 corners of a cube. You could see it, where every corner alternates between being a dielectron and an unpaired electron. So it turns out when you put iron when you make a crystal out of these, well, there's a little bit more to the story that I should say. We have to remember that these are metal atoms in a metal crystal. So there's still a 4th shell. The 4s2 electrons are the ones that delocalize to form the metallic bond. So you have a background matrix of this electron density, the conduction electrons, which is the valence electrons. And now you have these atomic cores without their 2 valence electrons, which have a positive charge. And those are going to be suspended throughout the crystal by mutual repulsion and by attraction to the electrons around them. But what's so interesting is that this arrangement that I showed you with these third shell electrons, these are on the surface of the atomic core, because the 4th shell valence electrons have now delocalized. So in a sense, they've become almost like valence electrons of the core, if you know what I'm saying. So the surface of those atomic cores has unpaired electrons on them. Now, manganese and chromium, the others all have those also, but they're not ferromagnetic. So if you look at the iron on our periodic table, which, by the way, the password is ferromagnetism for that. It's password protected, but for your viewers, they can.
We'll put a link in the
We're
description.
still working on some of the details and some of the aligning with observation, so I haven't made it totally public yet. But the concept is that it's not enough that the core of these atomic cores have unpaired electrons, because they're still separated from one another across that interatomic distance. So that's what paramagnetism is, that if I put that into a magnetic field, they'll all line up. But then when I remove the magnetic field, they can't talk to each other their spins can't interact because they're too far apart.
So these ones are actually crystally in contact with one another.
Right. So that means for iron to be ferromagnetic, these unpaired electron orbitals have to be extended outwards, radially outwards into that interatomic space in order that they can link up with one another. So how is that happening? Why does that happen in iron, but it doesn't happen in others? So if you look at the geometry on my iron entry on my periodic table on Quicycle, you'll see that, first of all, in this third shell, there's 4 unpaired electrons, but there's also 4 dielectrons. Now, dielectrons have a double negative charge. That's 2 electrons in there. So they're repelling the single electrons much more strongly. So those single electron orbitals are going to be constricted from the sides. They're being squashed inwards. The dielectrons will take up more space. The dielectron tetrahedron will take up the majority of the volume. And then those unpaired electrons are going to be squished. And just like, the figure skater bringing her arms in, where it makes you go faster. If you take a cylinder and you make it squash it in thinner, it'll go longer in response. It'll push the electron density a little bit further outward. But there's more to it than that. That is not enough by itself. If you look at the second shell, just within that third shell, it also has a full second shell. That's a tetrahedral arrangement of 4 dielectrons, and they are aligned. The dielectrons in the second shell are directly underneath the unpaired electrons in the third shell, because that's how they minimize repulsion. But that means that those unpaired electrons have a dielectron repelling them from beneath and dielectrons constricting them and repelling them from all sides. There's only one direction that they can extend, and that is radially outward. So that is what we are proposing, and that is that the reason that iron is ferromagnetic is because it has orbital constriction from the sides and from beneath, which extends those unpaired electrons into the interatomic space, allowing the adjacent iron atoms to parallel spin bond with each other in the same way that we explain for Hund's second rule for the stabilization of parallel spinning electrons in the same orbital. So they create a bond, and then when you align them with an external magnetic field, those alignments they link up, and when you remove the magnetic field, those spins remain. They are interacting with one another, so they hold each other in that spin alignment, and that is why iron, in our proposal, makes a permanent magnet.
I like it.
I like it. I like it too. I like it too.
And it's fascinating because if you think about the whole iron crystal as a whole, I mean, this is probably hard to see, but this is like a cubic. You can see each of these green things has 8 points on it. So that would be like our cubic iron atoms. It makes a double tetrahedral arrangement that in one direction through every iron atom, you're going to have a tetrahedral crystal, just like diamond, the same structure as a diamond crystal. You're going to have a tetrahedral crystal of unpaired electron, spin bonded, linked, a resonance of unpaired electrons throughout the crystal. And then anti-parallel to it, you have the same diamond-shaped tetrahedral crystal of dielectrons going in the opposite direction through every iron atom. You have a double tetrahedral arrangement of not only unpaired electron spins in a diamond crystal, but then you have non-bonding dielectrons in an antiparallel one, and that's going to serve to constrict those channels where the unpaired electrons are. So you have a very concentrated diamond-like crystal resonance of spin throughout the iron crystal, which is why it gives iron such a disproportionately strong ferromagnetism. It's the most ferromagnetic by far. It's much more ferromagnetic than cobalt and nickel are. And what's also interesting...
Is it more than neodymium?
Yes.
Really?
Yes.
Why are neodymium magnets so thought of as so strong?
Well, neodymium magnets are not pure neodymium. They're neodymium plus iron plus something boron. I think. Makes sense. So it has to. Pure neodymium has an interesting property called spin glass, where the magnetic domains kind of wander around and they independently and they change over time, which is kind of an anomalous thing that's been discovered. I haven't yet looked into that, but my intention is that to try and see whether this model accounts for what's being observed. One of the things that's observed is very interesting, and that is if you look at the melting point of iron, cobalt, and nickel, and you look at their Curie temperature, which is the temperature at which they lose their ferromagnetism, right? Iron, the melting points, iron is much stronger than cobalt, which is stronger than nickel, higher temperature. But in terms of the Curie temperature, cobalt has a higher one than iron, which means that while iron will take the highest temperature, iron will melt at the highest temperature and then cobalt lower. But cobalt will hold on to its magnetism to a higher temperature than iron will, even though iron has a stronger ferromagnetism than cobalt, which is very interesting. So it seems that this can account for why. I don't necessarily want to go into the details of it, but it's very interesting that iron has this tetrahedral relationship and it makes body-centered cubic crystals. And body-centered cubic crystals, when you turn them at their angle like this, you can see it makes a double tetrahedral structure. So body-centered cubic and tetrahedral are the same crystal structure, but cobalt is hexagonal close packing. And that's because the cobalt electron configuration is more hexagonal. Its three unpaired electrons are trigonal planar. So that means in their crystal, it's going to have corners where you have 3 electrons spin bonding together. You know, even though there's fewer connections per atom, those connections are 3 electron connections at those corners, which means that those spin bonding is going to be much stronger and it'll hold its magnetism longer. And whereas iron only has these 2 electrons from adjacent atoms, it has 4 of them per atom. So therefore, it makes the crystal interactions are much stronger, which gives it a higher melting point. So as we look at these observations and try and match it up with the ideas, it seems to be holding water at this point. And the other observation that we're looking at is the easy versus the hard directions of magnetization. If you take an iron magnet, if you try and magnetize iron, there's certain directions in the crystal that it'll be easier to magnetize than others. Some will be hard, will require more energy to magnetize. So we're also looking at, does this model account for those differences? And so far it seems to be holding together. So I'm busy working on writing this up in a paper, but we haven't put it out yet. So you're getting
it's really
this
cool.
is the first time I've actually shared in public about this. So you and your viewers are getting a sneak peek into a potential explanation for ferromagnetism.
It clarifies my own understanding. You know, we're always working on material. You know, we have another YouTube channel where we work on material explanations for atomic phenomenon, and I think that it fits right into the idea that the shape of the atom is responsible for all of these magical actions. You know, it's often said that the atom acts like a tiny magnet, but there's no real explanation given for what is happening fundamentally at that level. And
exactly,
I think this really plays into it. I've always thought that the chemists were, you know, in some sense, the most sane scientists, because they do have a schematization, like they have chemical equations and so forth, and they move electrons around. But ultimately, it comes down to the shape of these molecules as they fit together. And so the chemists have always had this real sense of how structure matters that I think has escaped a lot of quantum physicists.
Totally. And another interesting detail as well, if you look at palladium has a very strong paramagnetism, but according to the traditional explanation, it has 0 unpaired electrons in its electron configuration. So I take issue with that. That can't be the case. If it's strongly paramagnetic, it must have unpaired electrons. So I believe that palladium has a similar. Again, it's also interesting, you know, that something that's not really discussed in chemical circles that much, as far as I've heard. One of our Quicycle guys is a spectroscopist at JPL, and he and I were talking about this, and he said that a lot of the electron configurations are considered probable. When you get up to the D and the F block, things get a little fuzzier in the spectra. And plus, those atoms contain multiple different configuration possibilities, that a lot of which are at very similar energies. So it becomes a lot more difficult to nail down what the actual electron configurations are when you get up into the D and the F block. So I think,
and they're progressively more complex, because while you've been talking, I've been looking at the orbital diagrams, trying to see if I can figure out if there's anything, and nothing looks like iron, right? But when you get to the point of palladium, it's a really, really complex orbital diagram, which to me suggests that it's moving around a lot. And if it's moving around a lot, it's probably passing through some kind of intermediate state. And if it's passing through an intermediate state, then you can come to a point where it gets stuck the same way that iron does.
Yeah, and I think in my approach, I'm not trying to. Yes, that's true. There are going to be lots of different possibilities. So for me, I'm not trying to like say it's got to be this, it's got to be that. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to say, is there a electron configuration that is stable and symmetrical that could be one of the lower energy ones, meaning I'm trying to find at least one example that makes sense, that seems to accord with the properties. I don't mean to imply that it'll be the only one, as our friend Brian pointed out. There's going to be multiple in any given sample. There's going to be atoms that are going to be in different configurations within that sample. So, one has to, that's another possible explanation for the paramagnetism. It's that, if the majority of the atoms assume a particular state, then that'll determine perhaps what the paramagnetic strength is. But it's difficult when you get up to the bigger atoms because they are more complex and there's a lot going on there. And
is there a way to separate out the paired electrons? Is there a way to separate out charge and unpaired electrons from magnetism? Like, how do you assay the spin qualities or the unpaired versus paired qualities of an atom in a system? Is that done with magnetic fields predominantly, or is that what is the empirical basis of? You
mean of counting how many unpaired electrons there are?
Because you mentioned line spectra, so there's
the principle, the Hans rule principles, etc. They have a principle for ordering of filling the order of filling the orbitals, where you first fill one box with one electron and then you start to pair them up, etc. So there's but yeah, again, like Pauli's exclusion and Hans rule, a lot of these things are stated as principles because they've been observed that way or in the spectra, but they don't necessarily clarify what the physical mechanism is that makes them assume those structures. And that's what I'm trying to get at as well. And I'm specifically trying to do it within the construct of the subquantum mechanics that we've been working on in Quicycle. It's a different construct. I'm not trying to look at it necessarily through the lens of the traditional Schrödinger wave functions, even though when we come out with a speculation, it still has to match with observation. Observation is the arbiter. So that's why we're still in the middle of this whole process of really trying to quantify everything. And that's why I don't want to say too much about this, and I don't want to make it sound like I have it all figured out yet, because we're still very much, working on it. What we have done is come up with certain structural concepts which seem to be promising and seem to possibly account for some of the things that are observed, but there's definitely a way to go.
Yeah, it seems like the periodic table is, at least in some part, constructed based on predictions. Like, I know there was a number of elements that were put on the table before they were ever observed, and I wonder how much of the spin dynamics and the pairing dynamics are like that, where they're inferred rather than actually measured. I honestly don't know.
Well, I think that's what Brian was getting at, is that as you go up into the D and the F block, everything starts to get a little bit fuzzier. You can predict things, you can try and observe things, but even in the spectra, they get a little fuzzier. So plus it also depends on how you make your sample and how you measure with that sample. Like the experimental techniques are going to change what's observed also. So it becomes a little difficult to become very specific when you get up that high in the periodic table.
Yeah, do you know anyone who's empirically measuring these things?
Which things specific? The specific things that we're talking about? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I know just the paramagnetism properties of the more complex D block metals.
They've all been measured. We know how paramagnetic they are. If you look on Quicycle in the glossary, if you look at magnetic susceptibility, there's a little periodic table image there which has all the numbers of the strengths, the paramagnetic strengths. And there's another interesting thing also. If you look at aluminum, the other elements in the third group are diamagnetic, but aluminum is paramagnetic. but it's interesting because it has almost the exact same paramagnetic strength as sodium. Sodium's like 16.5 and aluminum 16, or vice versa, whatever. And sodium has only one unpaired electron in its valence shell, but aluminum supposedly has three. So it's interesting to me that it has the exact same paramagnetic strength as sodium. So to me, that and plus there are other interesting things about aluminum also. It's got very low density. It's a larger atom in crystal form than people thought it would be. It has, bigger interatomic distances. So I have a speculation about why that would be, and that is maybe there's three electrons in the outer shell of aluminum. Maybe only one of them delocalizes to form the metallic bond like sodium does, leaving the other two with a little bit of that dielectron character to it, and it's also interesting because aluminum is the fourth best electrical conductor after silver, copper, and gold. And silver, copper, and gold also have only one valence electron in their conduction band. So that's another reason that I think there may be something going on there that's interesting. So I don't know, there's a lot of interesting questions when you start looking at these things magnetically that don't seem to jive with the typical way that we think about them.
I think that the question that Shiloh is perhaps really asking is there anyone who is trying to probe whether or not the predictions of orbital shell filling are in line with reality? And that seems like a much harder question than just to probe a bulk property like paramagnetism, because
I don't know.
how would you even look to see what's happening on the level of a single orbital?
I think they're just looking at line emissions, like you said, like the way that the electrons transition between orbitals, the light that's given off is somehow a readout of their energetics. I mean, I'm just spitballing here. I don't actually know.
In the first and second row, the first, second, third row of the periodic table, that stuff's pretty solid. They're pretty clear, crisp lines. There's very little ambiguity there. But once you get into the D and the F block, things start getting a little bit more interesting.
It's very cool. Yeah, I love this work so much.
Thanks.
I'm excited. I want to read more of it. You sent me this email this morning, and I just had a chance to glance at it briefly and look over the blog.
Yeah, there's some really cool visuals in that entry for iron.
And
you have the tetrahedral thing is great.
It is, yeah. And you have these sort of simplified in terms of these spherical diagrams, but I think that I imagine that as you have more time and resources, that the shapes of these will really evolve as well. Am I right about that? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, on some of the elements, I've put two different versions of the pictures. I have ones where, in each direction you have a little sphere just showing the direction, but that's just meant to show the center of the orbital. But then I have other ones which show the complete shell, where the shell is divided into four equal segments, where electron density fills the entire circumference, which it has to do to cancel nuclear charge. So yeah, at some point I'm probably going to hire like a really good digital graphic artist to make much better representations, because I don't want people to get a misconception that these orbitals are little sphere shapes because they're not.
Yeah, we just started working with a new animator who's hopefully going to help us punch our channel up to the next level. And cool. I will definitely be, of course we'll credit you, but I'm definitely interested in animating some of these more complex orbitals besides the S shell, because the S shell was a hell of a project by itself, but moving beyond that has been really intimidating. And actually, we just discovered there's a project that is publishing Python scripts for orbital shapes based on different energetic inputs, and it'll give you you can see the line spectra that correspond to the different transitions and so forth. So I'm really hoping.
Cool. Will you share that with me when you find it?
Yeah, I can send it to you in an email afterwards. Heck, I'll just put a link in the description too for everybody. So I think that'll be really interesting if we can pull that into Blender, which is it's a free software for 3D animation. Pretty powerful too if your computer's up to the job.
Yeah, that's what a friend of mine used for those orbital shapes that are the tetrahedral.
Oh, nice.
Spherical ones.
Yeah, it's got a steep learning curve, but it's definitely accessible. Yeah. So anyways, I'm really excited, man. I'm really excited to study more of your work and
thank you.
Incorporate it into my own work. And I really like what you got going there. I think all of these ideas are ideas that are on the tips of many people's minds, and people are really hungry for these next level conceptions of the world we live in, of all of the data that's swimming around us and how to make sense of it. And certainly making geometric depictions of the atom that are capable of structurally interacting with one another to produce phenomena is a huge part of that puzzle.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate that work.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that the spirit of inquiry is alive and well in the world, and so it's always good to talk to other people who are focused on the same questions, because otherwise it can be kind of lonely.
Yeah. I think, like we said before, we're living in this age of this expansion of consciousness, and the internet is wonderful because there's so much information out there that those people that are looking are finding the things that are intuitive, and, symbiotic connections begin, and, people gravitate towards the things that make sense. And I think it reaches a critical mass where, science will start to be more efficient and objective in the way it's supposed to be.
And it might come from a lot of really tiny organizations. Not that your organization's tiny, ours is tiny, but the idea that people could rise up out of the woodwork to some extent and be studying things.
I think that's called a grassroots.
Grassroots, there you go. Makes it sound really cool. But the idea that independent organizations could spring up and start addressing major questions that were traditionally relegated to these very expensive institutions is a really promising potential that we're facing right now. And I'm really excited about it.
And I think interdisciplinary is such a great way to go. And I think science has become very insular in terms of the experts in a particular area being more closed than they used to be to ideas coming in from the outside. But in the past, that's always the way it was. Einstein, the patent clerk. I forget whether it was. I think it was maybe Avogadro, who was like a bookbinder as his profession. Or the Wright brothers, who had a bicycle repair shop.
De Broglie was a prince.
Yeah, there you go. So I think we need innovative ideas, and sometimes when you come from a slightly different vantage point, you lack the constrained thinking that it's very easy to get into a rut, especially because it's so hard to know the details of some of these complex fields. Like, it's so much and it's so hard, and then when you eventually get to understand it, you're like, now I've achieved something, and this must be right, and it's hard. It's hard to allow other ideas in. Human nature.
Well, there's never been a better time than now for change to occur. Yeah,
I agree.
Do you have any closing thoughts before we let you go? You want to put a cherry on the sundae, or?
Thank you for having me on again. I really appreciate the conversation.
Thanks for coming.
I appreciate what you guys are doing. I appreciate the opportunity to share these ideas.
And we appreciate the opportunity that you bring. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I look forward to seeing what comes next, man. We'll catch up with you, once you get this book out and once you're a little bit further down the road on your quest. And I'm sure we'll have even more to talk about.
Sounds good.
All right, Arnie, have a great rest of your day.
Take care.